understand that this was on such a scale as again to submerge the pyramids, but, at any rate, the population was drowned or driven out of the surrounding country, for a time. When, in turn, this flood passed away and population spread again over the land, there began that downward movement of spirituality and culture which, from the occultist's point of view, is the final brief period of the decadence of Egyptian civilization, though, for the modern Egyptologist, it includes the whole range of Egyptian history, behind which some inquirers begin to look out for the evidences of primitive man. Probably when the decadent period began, or was somewhat advanced, the tangible objects, whatever they were, which the Great Pyramid was designed to cover, were removed to some other country chosen as the headquarters of the world's adeptship. And though, as long as the ancient wisdom religion survived in Egypt to any considerable extent, the pyramids continued to fulfill their purpose as temples of initiation, by degrees, no doubt. The full knowledge concerning their uses in this respect faded out from among the people. On the face of things, it would only be by initiated adepts that chambers dedicated to secret ceremonies could be put to such uses, and with the fading out of the adept element in the population, due to its own moral deterioration, the old traditions would naturally be lost. This consideration will, amongst others, abundantly account for the multiplication of pyramids in comparatively recent ages, when, certainly, there was no thought on the part of the builders of using them in connection with the introduction of neophytes to the mysteries of occult science. As late as within the last few thousand years some of the pyramids along the Nile Valley have been erected. While, therefore, occult teaching entirely discountenances the conventional theory that the pyramids in all cases were put up to serve as the tombs of monarchs, it opens the door to conjectures along that road as regards some of the latest among them. From an antiquity with which the decadent dynasties had probably lost touch, the example of the earlier pyramids as a fashion in architecture had obviously been handed down. Certainly the coffer of the Great Pyramid was neither a sarcophagus nor, as Piazzi Smith conjectures, a standard measure of capacity, but a font in which certain baptismal ceremonies connected with initiations were carried out. It is possible, however, that in the later and degenerate period of Egyptian history, to which all the Manetho dynasties belong, some of the kings, losing touch with the ideas associated with the more ancient pyramids in the beginning, may have followed the fashion of their architecture without knowing why it was originally designed, and may have put up pyramids to be their tombs. I understand definitely that this was the case, but the fact in no way militates against the explanations just given. The Great Pyramid has been assigned by most Egyptologists to a king of the 4th dynasty, generally known as Cheops, or more correctly, to students of hieroglyphics, as Khufu. That monarch is supposed to have built it, and to have gone on adding to its size as long as he lived. As his reign was a long one, the enormous magnitude of the building, standing on a base the size of Lincoln's Inn Fields, is thus accounted for. My own information is to the effect that Khufu simply restored some portions of the pyramid that had suffered injury, also, for reasons that I have not heard stated, closing up some of the chambers that were previously accessible. It is admitted by modern Egyptologists that the evidence which points to Khufu as the builder of the pyramid is meager, although the original guess has been quoted so often now that most writers assume it to be somehow known as a fact. The manipulation of the enormous stones used in this edifice, as also, indeed, the construction of the Great Pyramid itself, can only be explained by the application to these tasks of some knowledge concerning the forces of nature which was lost to mankind during the decadence of Egyptian civilization and the barbarism of the Middle Ages, and has not yet been recovered by modern science. This branch of the subject, however, may be conveniently reviewed in connection with some other architectural bequests from the ages in which the adepts dispersed from Atlantis were still taking part in the external life of Egypt, and indeed, of some other countries now forming part of the European continent. In England itself we have architectural remains connected with the ascendancy here at one time of Atlantean adepts, the interpretation of which has been as much clouded by fantastic theories as by the passage of the ages that have gone by since their erection. Stonehenge is a riddle that has perplexed speculation as profoundly in its way as the pyramids themselves. Most archaeologists have assumed that it was erected by the Druids of ancient Britain, who were already disappearing as a priestly caste at the time of the Roman invasion. Although still carrying on secret and sanguinary rites to which some Roman historians have referred. This somewhat crude conjecture, which offered no explanation of the methods by which an uncivilized race of people like those inhabiting the Britain that Julius Caesar conquered, could have handled the enormous monoliths of which Stonehenge consists, did not satisfy Mr. James Fergusson, who has devoted so much painstaking research to the subject of the rude stone monuments, dealt with in his interesting volume bearing that title. Mr. Fergusson had a passion for discerning a recent origin in all the remains of antiquity, and, taking advantage of the obscurity that hangs over 200 or 300 years of English history. Following on the abandonment of these islands by the Romans, he has developed an elaborate hypothesis, according to which Stonehenge was erected in the time of King Arthur, to celebrate one of the 12 great battles in which that hero is said to have overthrown the heathen. Mr. Fergusson will have nothing to say to previous arguments that had assigned a religious purpose to the great relics on Salisbury Plain, and makes them out to have been nothing more than stones set up to commemorate a victory. He could not by any intentional efforts to that end have supplied us with a more grotesque reductio ad absurdum of that general view of the world which regards the civilization now around us as having grown up from an immediately preceding condition of primeval human infancy. One of the reasons for which Mr. Fergusson rejects the Druidical theory is derived from the impossibility of supposing that such a mere race of savages as the Romans found in Britain could have handled the stone masses of which the ruin in question consists. But he is content to pass lightly over this embarrassment in dealing with his own theory, on the assumption that after the Roman occupation the Britons would have picked up a good deal of engineering knowledge from their conquerors. The Romans themselves would have been no better able than the Britons to manipulate the materials of Stonehenge. The imposts or upper stones of the great trilithons are themselves about 11 tons each in weight, and the uprights 30 tons each. It is nonsense to talk of such masses as being moved about and set up in their places with great exactitude by builders simply employing the strength of human muscles in the work. The mechanical resources of the present day would be heavily taxed to erect a second Stonehenge beside the first. Nor is the absurdity of such a hypothesis measured merely by the weight of the monoliths on Salisbury Plain. By Mr. Fergusson's own admissions we have to bring into our survey of the past the remains of Stonehenge in Avebury, and also the innumerable dolmens that are found about these islands, and in larger numbers in France, Spain, and Scandinavia. It is no use to give an explanation that will fit in with facts in one case, if it fails to square with those of another. The dolmens have to be accounted for as well as the Arthurian battle memorials. And in the case of some among the dolmens the weights to be dealt with throw those of Stonehenge into the shade. Dolmens are simple structures, in which one mass of rock, the capstone, is hoisted up on 3 or more supports. And one measured in Cornwall, in the parish of Constantine, is computed to weigh 750 tons. Another in Pembrokeshire is a great tabular slab, big enough for 5 people on horseback to take shelter beneath it. What were the uses to which these strange monuments were put? The Arthurian hypothesis leaves the matter as much in the dark as the Druidical theory at which Mr. Fergusson takes offence. And the notion that the Britons might have become qualified to raise capstones weighing 750 tons, merely because they had picked up some engineering skill by watching the Roman roadmakers, is too childish to consider seriously. People who contend, with Mr. Fergusson, that the rude stone monuments must have been put up in the 3rd and 4th centuries, because we know they have not been built since, while they could not have been erected by primeval savages, are simply, without setting out on that argument consciously, making smooth the path that conducts us back, in search of an explanation, to a civilization anterior to our own, the traces of which have all but evaporated from the records from which, till lately, we have been constructing the history of the ancient world. Atlantis is the only rational clue to the comprehension of Stonehenge, just as it affords the only satisfactory solution of ancient Egypt. The information on the subject to be gathered from those to whom the memory of nature is an open book, shows us the dispersed adepts from Atlantis as the founders in Western Europe of the religious rites that Stonehenge was designed to subserve. At a much later period than that which witnessed the Atlantean migration to Egypt, some representatives of the higher Atlantean occultism established themselves in the country which, in the subsequent changes of physical geography, was destined to become the British Isles. Their influence established a civilization among the people which did not prove of the strong and enduring character attaching to that planted in Egypt, but which, nevertheless, gave rise to considerable cities, all traces of which have now passed away. And Stonehenge was erected as a temple, in which the exoteric worship they taught to the people could be carried on. It was never covered with any roof. Its rude structure was purposely adopted by the exiles from Atlantis as a mute protest against the corrupt luxury of the perishing civilization they had left behind. In Atlantis itself the human family had touched the nadir point of materiality. Great developments of scientific knowledge had been turned entirely to the service of the physical life, and spiritual aspiration was entirely stifled in the pursuit of material welfare. Personal luxury, cultivated by those who were strong enough to secure it for themselves, was the goal to which all the energies of the race were bent. Many secrets of nature, which the science of this fifth race has not yet recovered, were degraded to the exclusive service of physical enjoyment by the dominant classes, for an inferior servile race also inhabited the country, and the spiritual adepts of the period turned with disgust from a community which it was not in their power to redeem. They set themselves the task of implanting amongst a simpler and relatively barbarous population abroad, whose descendants were destined, in progress of time, to melt into the next great race, the spiritual enthusiasm that might, in their case, lead on to an ennobled future. So the external ceremonies of the religion they taught were carried on under their guidance with stern simplicity. They built their great temple, of unhewn rooks. They sought no architectural effects that would divert attention from nature. They invested their great cathedral with no other claims to admiration but those depending on the massive grandeur of its proportions. But how did they overcome the difficulty of manipulating the huge masses of stone, the mere superposition of which, one upon the other, seems to have demanded mechanical resources which we can hardly associate in imagination with any period but our own? For that matter, in Atlantis itself it may be found, when fuller light is ultimately cast upon its history, that mechanical resources of a very advanced order were available for any work that needed them. But the builders of that age were not exclusively dependent on appliances of the kind we now make use of in handling large masses of material. In the maturity of Atlantean civilization some forces of nature, now only under the control of adepts in occult science, were in general use. The adepts of the time were under no obligation to keep the secret of their existence jealously guarded. And among them was that power, so rarely exercised now that its very existence is scornfully derided by the commonplace crowd, the power of modifying the force we call gravity. It is rarely of use in public utterances in the present day, when current intelligence is engaged in channels far removed from those of occult attainment. To speak of adept powers that are wholly out of gear with modern experience of natural possibilities. But in reference to the peculiar power to which I have just referred, the truth is that the modification of the force of gravity, by methods human ingenuity may bring into play, can only seem absurd to people who are ignorant of certain suggestive facts already within the experience of scientific investigation and, at the same time, willfully blind to the evidence of mysterious occurrences notoriously taking place, though altogether unexplained so far, in the realm of spiritualistic experience. Theosophists are, of course, very far from accepting the theories of spiritualism in regard to the destinies of the human soul after death. But the external facts, familiar to the investigators of spiritualism, are facts nonetheless which must be fitted into their places in any conceptions of nature framed by intelligent reasoning. The foolish crowd ignore these, because impostors are constantly detected in imitating by trickery the comparatively rare phenomena which, under the auspices of spiritual mediumship, illustrate the occasional activity of forces that set at defiance the very limited knowledge of natural secrets generally diffused amongst us at present. But the remark attributed to Galileo, per si move, is highly applicable in this case. In face of all that has been recorded by qualified spiritualistic investigators, a body of testimony which is not affected in the smallest degree by exposures of sham spiritualism in other cases, it is curiously illustrative of the capacities of human stupidity. That people, fancying themselves clear-headed and sagacious, should continue to discredit the fact that, at spiritual seances, heavy objects are sometimes levitated, caused, that is, to rise or even float about in the air under the influence of invisible agencies, or forces that have for the time being counteracted, as far as such objects are concerned, the usually operative force called gravity. But that which happens only now and then, no matter how rarely, must be traceable, if only we knew enough, to the operation of some law as natural as that under which steam expands. Nor is there anything in the essence of the matter more mysterious in the fact that solid objects are sometimes repelled from the earth, or levitated, than in the other fact that more usually they are attracted. No modern physicist has as yet any glimmering conception as to why or how gravity works. We are no better informed at this moment than Newton as to why the apple falls. We can, to a certain extent, measure the force which controls it. We do not know what that force is. So with magnetism. There we have an agency we can observe in action both ways, as an attractive and as a repulsive force. Stimulate an electromagnet in one way and it will attract iron. Stimulate it in another way and it will repel copper, so that a mass of that metal may be visibly levitated and kept floating on nothing, apparently, at some height above the apparatus repelling it. Electricians observe and can reproduce the fact. They do not understand it. The levitation of tables and human beings at spiritual stances can only be observed occasionally and cannot be reproduced at will, not by ordinary observers, at all events, but the fact has to be faced by reasonable men, and brought into relation with our general thinking. It is stupid to attempt an escape from the difficulty of not understanding it by declaring, in spite of the evidence, that the fact is not a fact. When, therefore, theosophists learn from those among them in a position to become acquainted with the powers exercised by the adepts of occult science, that such persons can in the present day, as of old, modify the action of the force we call gravity, so as to levitate ordinarily heavy objects like masses of stone, there ought not to be any indignant revolt of the understanding against such a statement. As yet it is impossible to offer the ordinary reader direct evidence to that effect of a kind that is calculated to compel his belief. But the general situation, as I have shown, is such that any positive declaration of disbelief in the allegation can only be due to ignorance or stupidity. Therefore, we who have what we hold to be trustworthy information on the matter may at least put it forward, very careless of scoffing, which, in view of collateral knowledge now available, stands self-condemned as irrational. The adept custodians of that knowledge, concerning the mysteries of nature, which is filtering into the world at large by degrees as science advances, can and always have been able to control the attractions of matter in such a way as to alter the effective weight of heavy bodies at will. That is the whole explanation of the marvels of megalithic architecture. Working under the guidance and with the help of the adepts from Atlantis, the builders of Stonehenge, and of the ancient dolmen altars found the enormous masses of stone they used light enough to be handled with facility. Clairvoyant observers of Stonehenge have seen the process of its construction going on. The pictures of its progress are all indelibly imprinted on the memory of nature, they are visible now, as plainly as the actual transactions were visible for those who were present. And the vision shows us the enormous masses of the trilithons being raised to their places with the help of scaffoldings, no more substantial in their character than would be used today in the erection of a brick cottage. Of course, although I did not interrupt my narrative of the origin of the pyramids to say so, the great stones of which they are composed were treated in the same way as the materials of Stonehenge. The adepts who directed their construction facilitated the process by the partial levitation of the stones used. This is the simple, though in one way no doubt deeply mysterious, explanation of the Old World monuments in which enormous masses of stone are employed. At the Temple of Baalbek, in Syria, there are single stones built into the walls, each of which is calculated to weigh about 1,500 tons. Preferring an explanation of such remains which only seems reasonable because it makes no appeal to forces and powers with which we are unacquainted, archaeologists have hitherto been content to assume that, with an unlimited command of human labor, the builders of such temples as that of Baalbek may have been able to get their great stones dragged along causeways on rollers, and may somehow have hoisted them up into their places with the help of inclined planes. Such hypotheses make larger drafts upon credulity really than those involved in the occult statement. They call upon us to believe that which is physically impossible. But the impossibility is acceptable because it is disguised in commonplace phraseology. Stonehenge and Baalbek really stand before us imperishable proofs that, in the age of their construction, whenever that may have been, the world was witness of an engineering which did not accomplish its triumphs by brute strength, but by the application of a finer knowledge than even modern engineering has as yet recovered. I have said that it was at a much later period than that at which the Atlantean adepts, who first left the perishing continent, took up their residence in Egypt. That those who settled in Western Europe set on foot the grand and simple spiritual worship which Stonehenge in the first instance was employed to subserve. It was at a much later period even than that at which the pyramids were erected. I do not know whether there was any long residence by Atlantean adepts in Western Europe prior to the introduction of their teaching among the people. Probably there was, but, at all events, it was near the final culmination of the great Atlantean continent's submergence, about 100,000 years ago from the present time, that the grey stones still standing on Salisbury Plain were first established in their places. Among the facts concerning them, which supporters of Ferguson's grotesque theory have to pass over very lightly, is one which relates to the geological character of the stones used. The outer circle and the stones of the great trilithons are of a composition that suggests their derivation from quarries in the neighborhood. But the inner circle and the altar stone are of a totally different formation, of a kind which cannot be identified with any rock beds in that part of England. Such stone is to be found in Cornwall, in Wales, and in Ireland, but nowhere nearer. So from one of these regions the materials of the inner circle must certainly have been brought. Reasoning of the kind that is never shocked by an absurdity, but is only offended by the suggestion that modern knowledge does not embrace all the capacities of nature, is content complacently to suppose that the Stonehenge builders brought the massive materials in question across many hundred miles of primeval forest-covered country, or by sea, all for the sake of a battle memorial on Salisbury Plain, when abundant stone, just as good and durable, was to be had in the neighborhood. The nature of the Stonehenge materials would be alone enough to make the Arthurian theory ridiculous, even if it would bear consideration along other lines of attack. For the purposes of a mystic temple, however, everyone who has a glimmering of occult knowledge will apprehend that there may have been considerations connected with those subtle attributes of different kinds of stone, which occultists generally call their magnetism, that would prescribe the employment of more than one kind. The worship of the early Druids, to give that name to the occult teachers who made Stonehenge their headquarters, was grandiose and simple. There were processions and chants and symbolical ceremonies associated with astronomical events, especially with the rising of the sun on Midsummer Day, when great crowds of people assembled to witness the sun's rays, at the moment of his rising, shoot through an opening opposite to the altar, and illuminate the sacred stone. There were no unholy sacrifices offered on the altar in those days, and the only external ceremony of a sacrificial nature that took place had to do with a libation of milk that was poured over the stone. In accordance with the elaborate symbolism of early occult rites, a great deal of importance was attached to the serpent as an emblem of multifarious significance, and as the adept Druids could easily control these creatures, an actual living serpent was made to glide up into the altar stone at the sunrise ceremony, and lap the milk. There is some truth, but much more misconception, in prevailing notions concerning what is called the serpent worship of olden times. The failure of modern students of religion to discriminate between worship and the use of symbols has had to do with graver misconceptions even than those which have entangled the commonplace interpretations of serpent worship. The chief Druid of the Stonehenge ceremonies in the days of the pure worship in the beginning used to march in some of the processions with a live serpent round his neck. Later on, when the adept influence was no longer present, many millenniums later, the degraded chiefs of the Druid decadence used to keep up the old tradition in so far as it lay in them to do so. But for prudential reasons wore a dead serpent, a more fitting emblem than they supposed of the state of the faith they represented. Lower and lower its practices became debased, until the once sacred altar stone was deluged no longer with milk, but with the blood of human victims, and this was the only sort of Druid worship of which, through Roman historians, we have any written records. How did it happen that so terrible a change came on? The age apparently, as far as ancient Britain was concerned, was not sufficiently advanced to provide the earlier adepts with a continuous line of successors. Eventually, it is to be presumed, one by one, no doubt, the earlier adepts ceased to incarnate among the people they could not lead on to the path of true spiritual progress. In Egypt the graft planted took a firm hold of the stock to which it was attached. In Britain it did not, and thus, while Egypt remained to a comparatively recent period a land of high civilization, and one of the principal centers of fifth-race adeptship, Britain relapsed back into barbarism. Up to only a few thousand years before the Roman conquest it remained still faintly tinged with the remote traditions of its vanishing civilization. Then it sank to its lowest condition of decay before the commencement of its modern cycle of progress within the historic period. This sweeping survey of a past that will be more fully recalled, no doubt, in progress of time, as the world learns better to appreciate the inner faculties of man, slight and sketchy though it be, has only been rendered possible by much patient gleaning on my part, opportunities being made use of as they arose. It is possible at a later date that I may be able to fill up some details. But I hope the imperfect suggestions of this essay may meanwhile be accepted as contributing in some measure to show how imperatively necessary it is to bring the Atlantean origin of all civilizations belonging to our age into the scheme of our thinking, if we are to hope for anything resembling a correct interpretation of the ancient world. Theosophical teachings liable to be misunderstood. In the beginning of our theosophical studies we had to be content with very crude conceptions concerning the great ideas to which we were then introduced. It was not possible for those who were endeavoring to teach us to convey to us, all at once, a comprehension of those higher planes of nature, some understanding of which is absolutely necessary to a correct appreciation of even some fundamental principles that we have to deal with. Indeed, that embarrassment has, it seems to me, impeded all attempts at metaphysical thought that have antedated the theosophical movement. Intensely keen intellectual activity has been devoted to the effort to penetrate the veil of Isis, to outstrip the range of the physical senses, to determine the nature of matter, and to analyze processes of thought. But it has all amounted to very little as compared with the lot of significant teaching that we have been able to obtain during the theosophical period. With the help of this, by degrees, it has come to pass that, in spite of the enormous difficulty of grappling in imagination with conditions of consciousness outside those with which we are familiar, we have gradually been able to surround some of the earlier teaching with illumination which invests it with fuller meaning than we could attach to it at first. We have thus come to realize that some of our earlier conceptions, though not erroneous, indeed, no teaching that I have had to do with, as given to us in the beginning, need at this later date be withdrawn as erroneous, were incomplete to that extent that they have given rise to misunderstandings. And the attempt to clear up some of those misunderstandings is the task on which I am now venturing to enter. Foremost amongst theosophical teachings liable to be misunderstood, for want of adequate comprehension concerning conditions of life hereafter and on higher planes, stands that fundamental idea, reincarnation. The great law which from the earliest beginnings of theosophical study we have realized as an essential principle of evolution. Not only among theosophists has the idea been appreciated. It is even surprising, considering how much there is in the idea to excite repugnance on the part of people who do not understand it properly, that it has made way to the extent that we have seen, gradually conquering acceptance more widely than theosophical teaching does this generally. It has frequently been defended in pulpits as not incompatible with ordinary religious teaching. It has been accepted by people quite outside the range of theosophical influence, as the only possible explanation of what seems the terrible injustice reigning in the world, the mysterious inequalities of condition that we see around us. The differences not merely of welfare, but of moral and intellectual development, of environment, and so forth, which render human life so painfully variegated. But theoretical acceptance of the idea has not always rendered it welcome to people who want to realize precisely how the law will work when they come to be reincarnated. Who are troubled with anxieties in that way that render the whole conception exceedingly repulsive. They persist in thinking of themselves as plunged afresh into babyhood, as coming back with the consciousness they are now invested with, to be again subject to the appalling limitations of the infant condition. They think of themselves as fretting against the limitations of the baby state, wearily enduring their slow progress towards maturity. We have to get rid of all such ideas absolutely and entirely before we understand what reincarnation means, and the first difficulty in the way of getting rid of them has to do with the distinction between the personality of any given life and the ego of which that personality is a temporary expression. As we approach an understanding of this distinction, a new difficulty is apt to spring up. When told that the personality of any given life is going to be merged in the ego, as we are definitely assured will be the case as a rule, to the extent that the details of the last life will fade by degrees from memory. That seems to imply something resembling the annihilation of personal consciousness, the only kind which seems real, as contemplated from the physical plane point of view. The same comfortless thought surrounds a mistaken conception that has sometimes been put forward in regard to the ultimate destinies of humanity at the conclusion of the Manvantara. The alleged reabsorption in that divinity out of which in the beginning humanity emerged. Of course, if personalities even remotely resembling what they are now were absorbed into divinity, as a drop of water is absorbed in the ocean, that would be equivalent to annihilation. And emergence in the ego when the personality is passing on from this life to another seems, again, a species of annihilation, for most people unable to escape, in imagination, from the conditions of the current personality. Now what we have to remember, first of all, in order to get rid of that misconception, is that protracted and vivid conditions of life intervene between the disappearance from this plane of any given personality and the next presentation of the ego on the physical plane in accordance with the law of rebirth. A very long interval elapses before the personality with which we are associated in any given life has accomplished its mergence in the ego. I have dealt to some extent with that subject on former occasions, but it requires continued attention. Remember that, first of all, we have a considerably protracted experience, which may extend to enormous length sometimes, of life in which the personality is maintained in full completeness on the higher levels of the astral plane. In a large number of cases people whose personalities have been highly evolved, and who represented great intellectual development in this life, elect to remain on the higher levels of the astral plane for long after the time when they might have passed on to manasic conditions, had they so chosen. Because under those conditions it is possible for them to gather fresh knowledge along the line of their previous work, and prepare themselves in their next incarnation for much more extended activities of a similar order. In a minor degree the same explanation applies to people of less advanced evolution, though we have to remember, in trying to think out the conditions of future life, that they vary to an almost illimitable extent. It is difficult in attempting to interpret any of these mysteries to make adequate allowance for that. Whereas highly intellectual people will elect to remain for a long time on the higher level, people of lesser advancement also, assuming that their lives have not been very bad indeed, will long remain on levels where life is exceedingly enjoyable, though not necessarily in such cases very conducive to further progress. But in all cases there comes a time when, in fulfillment of the necessities of further evolution, all the inhabitants of the astral world must pass on to the manasic condition. We must not think of this passage as in the nature of a second death. It is quite free from all the anxieties and distrust that, too often, embitter the approach of physical dissolution, and it is hardly necessary to say utterly free from the suffering so often attending departure from this plane. During astral life a good many of the attributes that contributed to make up the personality have faded away. Its higher emotions, its love energies, its intellectual capacities remain unimpaired, but it has already shed most of the minor attachments arising from its earthly life. It is getting ready for that union with the ego which must not be thought of as accomplished at once on leaving this plane of life. Whatever desires may have been engendered for the continuance of personal existence, those desires will operate to retain vivid consciousness of personality on appropriate levels of nature for as long as their force can persist. But, as I say, the ego, the real permanent self, is a more permanent thing than any one personality, and, however important any given personality may be compared with those that have preceded it in the long career of the ego through nature, its importance has to be expressed in a new environment, to clear the way for which the minor details of the last incarnation have been allowed to fade away or evaporate. But the ego and the personality must not be thought of as two separate entities. The personality is, at all events, a partial expression of the ego and, sooner or later, the earth-plane consciousness is withdrawn into the ego, sometimes rapidly, sometimes after a long interval. But eventually in all cases that has to be accomplished. And the blending means the absorption into the ego of all that was important in the personality that has lately been spent. There is another interesting thought connected with that idea. Sooner or later a personality may become so important that it is perpetuated, so to speak, and invests the ego with its own coloring, instead of assuming from the ego the coloring of former accumulated experiences. That, of course, will only happen at the threshold of a very exalted condition of development, and it does not apply to the majority of people at the present stage of our life. I must now go back for a moment to the misunderstanding about baby consciousness. It is quite possible that some of you may have read accounts of strange experiences that have sometimes been known in the Eastern world. I am thinking especially of some cases in Tibet, where babies who have been recognized as reincarnations of a former incarnation have actually been able to prove their identity by pointing out hiding places in which the former personality had stowed away various objects, with a view to its ultimate identification. And, in some cases, the actual baby form has uttered words identifying itself with the former incarnation. That need not be thought of as conflicting with what I just now said. Whenever that has taken place, and I believe it has taken place, I do not want to repudiate the stories. It would represent a great adept achievement from the background, so that it may be set aside altogether as inapplicable to ordinary life. And almost equally inapplicable to ordinary life are the cases in which very young children, before the age of 7, have been known to exhibit extraordinary faculties. I think these have generally had to do with the reincarnation of great musicians. We are all familiar with the precocity of Mozart, who is said to have begun playing the piano at 6 years of age. In reference to these one can only say again that they are altogether abnormal. Merely guessing at the previous conditions that might explain such cases, I would suggest that they represent an intense eagerness on the part of the ego to express, on the physical plane, some of the musical ideas gathered from experience on the manasic level. We have always been led to believe that on the manasic level music somehow pervades the whole region, appealing, of course, in very varying degrees to different aptitudes, but filling the consciousness of the advanced musician with musical ideas he would be eager to reproduce. Probably in a similar way, when the mathematical faculty has become the leading mental characteristic of an ego, that condition may equally impel the ego to seek an early opportunity for its expression on the physical plane, and may account for the calculating boys one has sometimes heard of. Though we have in connection with such cases to explain, the best way we can, the usual fact that the abnormal faculty disappears or weakens as the boy grows up. Such facts bring us into relation with a great volume of nature's mysteries, which show how, at early stages of evolution, there seems to be a closer connection with the spiritual plane than when fuller intellectual development has been reached. Babies, animals, and early savage tribes will sometimes give evidence of possessing glimmerings, at all events, of astral perception which fade away at later stages of growth. I come now to consider various possibilities which have to do with the reattachment of the ego to a bodily manifestation. In the case of egos sufficiently advanced along the path of that progress to which knowledge is so conducive, it may be possible for the higher self, if I may use that expression, or the ego, I am using the two terms as almost synonymous, to exercise a definite choice in regard to the new incarnation on which it will enter. People already at some stage on the path especially if they are called upon to return rather sooner than the ordinary law would provide for, would probably have a considerable range of choice in regard to the incarnation they would accept. I have been privileged to obtain some information bearing upon cases that have actually occurred, and a curious discovery emerges. In all such cases of which I have heard, where several opportunities have lain before an ego coming into incarnation, some apparently very much less attractive than others, it seems almost invariably the case that the ego chooses the least desirable incarnation, as its desirability would be measured from our point of view. Incarnations in humble life involving a great deal of what, from our point of view, we should consider hardship and undesirable conditions have continually, within my knowledge, been chosen by people of sufficient advancement to exercise a choice, in preference to those representing more agreeable conditions of life on this plane. From the ego point of view, nothing is of really any importance compared with spiritual growth and progress, and it may not infrequently happen that the humbler incarnation is, first of all, calculated to get rid of karma that lies in the background, while it also not infrequently happens that the humbler incarnation is distinctly more conducive to devotion to spiritual thought and effort than those where pleasures and distractions of all kinds keep people's thoughts centered on the life that they are actually leading. And again it may happen, though I am now about to speak of a case that is probably unique, that some definite work that a highly evolved ego has undertaken can be better carried out in a humble than in an exalted station of life. Most students of philosophical literature will be more or less familiar with the writings of that wonderful German philosopher Jacob Boehme. Now Jacob Boehme's writings show him to have been on the threshold, at all events, of high adeptship, and yet in that life he was a humble cobbler, just a subordinate worker at that humble trade. Why did he choose such an incarnation as that? For it is certain that a being on his level must have chosen his incarnation. The answer I understand to be that at the period in which he lived it was not desirable that the teachings he had to put forward, real theosophic teachings, though not illustrated with the amplitude of detail we have since been privileged to obtain, should descend upon the world from any altitude of authority. Only a few were ripe for them. It was held to be necessary that they should be suggested, so to speak, from a humble level of mundane authorship. I am not presuming to endorse or criticize that idea. I merely state it as given to me in explanation of the Jacob Boehme incarnation. But why, I asked, such a very ignoble position as that of a working cobbler? The answer, I believe derived from himself, was, no position can be ignoble in which you are fulfilling the purpose of the Logos. That seems to me to have been an extremely beautiful answer, radiant with meaning that can be applied to many of the phenomena of life. True, there are not many working cobblers who are Jacob Boehmes in disguise, and we must not be hurried into conclusions to the effect that it is only on such levels of life that great spiritual natures are to be sought for. Indeed, the normal rule is rather the other way about. There is a tendency in nature to a gradual upward drift in social station in the long progress of incarnations. This ensues from the way in which desire, in ordinary life, is one of the factors making up the next karmic program. The desire must be clear and definite to be operative in this way, and it would not amount to much if a costermonger desired to be a king. He would not know enough about the king's life to desire that with precision, nor even if his desire pointed to a less exalted station could it be definite enough to have a karmic value. But he may fully realize the conditions of life a little better than those he might be used to, and then the desire assumes creative force, always supposing the man does not engender, in other directions, bad karma that conflicts with his desire. But all these last remarks obviously apply to levels of life below those inspired by genuine spiritual aspiration. When this is sufficiently developed for the ego to feel it as his predominant motive, it sweeps away all minor ambitions. So, as I say, on the higher levels choice enters into this matter. When it does not enter, which is the case with the vast majority of our fellow creatures, the guidance is accomplished again in various ways. For those sufficiently advanced, but not on the path, there are divine beings in the higher order of the great adept hierarchy whose function it is to direct incarnations and actually guide each ego, with a perception of its spiritual needs, into the incarnation suitable for its further expression. On a lower level again, if we go back to the conditions of savage life, or even to the conditions of very humble life in civilized countries, well, the truth is, as I have definitely been told, for a great many egos, that anyone of 50 incarnations would do equally well, and therefore there is no specific individual guidance in such cases. You will always remember that the human race is a vast procession proceeding through the ages, the members of which represent very different conditions of growth and progress, very different claims upon the authority which rules the whole. Let us consider the course of events in the case of an ordinary ego representing civilized development, a certain amount of progress along the lines of evolution and intelligence, and so forth, but no abnormal spiritual growth. Such an ego will be drafted into an appropriate incarnation under pressure of forces of which it has no practical consciousness, and for a long time will be unconscious of having re-entered this plane of life at all. There is a link established between itself and the new life, we do not know what terms to use. Physical plane nature does not enable us to handle phrases which suit these conditions, but some mysterious magnetic thread or tie attaches the ego to the new birth. And for a long time it is quite unconscious of any such attachment, unconscious probably for at least 7 years. The first 7 years of a child's life do not represent intelligent consciousness within that organism. Perhaps that statement will shock enthusiastic mothers who believe that from a very early age they detect all sorts of charming attributes in their offspring. They may, but I do maintain from what I have been told that as far as the real ego consciousness is concerned it is not really active within the child until at least 7 years have been spent, and then only to a very limited degree. Then, no doubt, the ego will be conscious of its reattachment to the physical plane, but not conscious to any extent which is a serious impediment to its spiritual consciousness on higher planes. It will not be until another septenary period has been passed, for these septenary periods have a very definite significance in connection with the growth of new lives, it is not until another stage of distinct progress has been accomplished that the etheric and astral elements in the new child's composition become identified with the ego in the background. I am not going to attempt a very minute explanation of the successive stages through which nature works in bringing an ego into a new incarnation. But the 2 septenary periods that I have mentioned are by no means all that are recognizable as stages in the process. The real truth I believe to be that it is not until full maturity is reached, not till such an age as 28, or even a later period than that, that the highest elements in the ego are capable of functioning in the new organism. I believe, even as far as the period of 35, it may sometimes be said that the new incarnation is not absolutely in its completely perfected condition. So that no conception of this subject can be more wide of the truth than that which embarrasses the idea of reincarnation with the belief that, in the earlier stages, the experience is distressing to the entity coming back. 1 or 2 other thoughts still remain to be emphasized in connection with this process of reincarnation. A great deal was said in earlier writings on the subject of devotion, and later interpretations have modified without contradicting what was said in the beginning. There are numerous cases in which devotion is little more than a blissful idleness in which the personality that has passed from this life into the devotion state exists in a perfectly happy condition for as long a period as the energies created or brought into activity during the past life are capable of manifesting themselves on a higher plane. In all such cases the mergence into the ego is effected unconsciously. All such processes are guided by higher intelligence outside that of the ego itself. And it would only be in a very advanced condition indeed that the ego would be perfectly conscious of what it was doing as it gradually absorbed into itself the experiences of the last life. You have always to remember that on the highest conditions that men are capable of reaching we take our destinies into our own hands. On intermediate conditions they are guided for us by beings of a high order in the hierarchy supervising human affairs, and on much lower levels, what we may call the common levels of nature, operating in a vast area. They are guided for us by beings of a lower order in the spiritual hierarchy. A good deal was said in the beginning of our studies in reference to the periods which usually elapse between incarnations. In my own first book on the subject, those who have read it may remember that I spoke, under guidance of course, of the intervening period which applied to the average of mankind, as running from 1,500 to 2,000 years, during which, of course, life was divided between astral conditions and devachanic or manasic conditions. Only after this very ample scope had been given for the exhaustion of all the forces of the previous life did the entity come back into incarnation. There was nothing untrue in that statement at the time, but a very remarkable condition of things has arisen since that statement was put forward. We live in a very remarkable period, remarkable not merely for its extraordinary development of theosophical knowledge amongst us in the world at large, but in other ways as well. And amongst other features that are remarkable in this period is the extraordinary acceleration of all processes which have to do with human evolution. I think we have many of us noticed this acceleration as applied to the phenomena of life around us, even in reference to the changes that have been going on the physical plane. Looking back over the past 50 years, we see that immense progress has been made in science, in discovery, in moral development, in religious thought all over the world. And that acceleration has been going on with even greater rapidity and energy on the higher planes of nature. It has to do, of course, with the difference between the downward and the upward arcs of evolution. On the downward arc of evolution, the great preparatory process of nature, progress is slow. On the upper arc of the cycle it is quick, and we are beginning now, having turned the corner as regards this world period, to feel the accelerating influence of the upward arc of evolution. And the accelerating influence, I am told, has definitely operated within the last 30 years, to accelerate the return to incarnation of such people as we are talking about when we speak of civilized communities. I leave out of account those who are on the path. A condition that probably applies to a good many of my readers, whether they are fully aware of it or not, most likely to a majority of those who take a real, deep and serious interest in theosophical teaching. They come under the operation of a new law altogether, and their incarnation may be accelerated far beyond any such periods as we have been talking about. But dealing with the general run of civilized mankind, the acceleration is producing this effect, for a considerable number of advanced egos in the civilized world. A period of only about 300 years is now going to be an average period for the intervening time between two lives. For a larger number representing, of course, a somewhat less evolved condition of either spiritual or intellectual growth, a 700-year period is going to be the average. And for probably a still larger number representing normal conditions of ordinary life, a 1,000-year period is going to be the average instead of that 1,500-year period which prevailed during the earlier part of the last century. We all heard a great deal at the beginning of theosophical work of the wonderful drift of knowledge from the Eastern world to the West. Ex Orient Lux is the most familiar maxim connected with theosophical study and one which represents a profound truth. But as so many other things have changed in the process of time, a change is coming over the whole condition of what may roughly be called the occult world in incarnation. By that I mean the whole body of people who are moving in the direction of higher knowledge, who are gradually coming in considerable numbers onto what we call the path leading to the higher life. Who are coming to appreciate the openings of knowledge that have been available for us in recent years. In former times such people were more numerous in the Eastern than in the Western world, and the consequence used to be that incarnations drifted, in the case of people with distinct spiritual aspiration, from the Western world to the Eastern. Indeed, when our theosophical teaching began to excite interest here, I know that some of my own friends aspired to Eastern incarnations as probably conducive to more rapid spiritual growth than could be accomplished in any other way. That idea I think was an erroneous aspiration so far as it applied to any people within our own lifetime, though not erroneous in times long gone by. But now it is distinctly out of date. The drift of incarnation for those who represent exalted conditions of preparedness for higher things, is now rather from the East to the West. The truth of the matter is that, although we are so far only concerned with beginnings, the Western world is going, in by no means a remote future, to be the great radial center from which spiritual influence will spread over the civilized world. And therefore, as I say, at the present time such an aspiration as that which I referred to a while ago as operative with some of my earlier friends in connection with theosophical study, the desire for Eastern incarnations, is wholly out of date. What we have to do now is to recognize the duties that are gradually coming to be incumbent on the Western world in connection with the spiritual progress of mankind. Looking back to the beginning of civilization, to the Atlantean period, when there was not any Europe to talk about at all the development, such as it was, both spiritual and intellectual, was centered in the Atlantean world. Of course, the Atlantean population gradually spread over the whole of the habitable globe, and all that we now speak of as the Eastern world was, please to remember, once Atlantean. Earlier subraces of the Atlantean period accounted for the earliest populations, whether of India, of any part of Central Asia, or of any part of the Eastern world. And as the spiritual civilization of Atlantis became defiled by the growth of evil in the shape of what we commonly call black tendencies, so the best representatives of advanced Atlantean spirituality migrated eastward. And in that way established in the Eastern world the great radiating center of spiritual energy in days gone by. And that condition of things lasted for a very long while. Of course, at a period which again is a very long while ago from our point of view, 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, when Atlantean adepts migrating from Atlantis proper to escape the evil developments of its civilization established themselves in Egypt, they met another stream of spiritual civilization flowing westward from India and regions beyond India that had been engendered, so to speak, by the fermentation of loftier thought in the earlier races of the Atlantean period. Thus, when Atlantis ultimately disappeared and was destroyed by reason of the fact that it had become so utterly degraded, you have to think of the Eastern world as wholly representative of spiritual growth. But we also have to recognize as an absolute fact that in the progress of subracial development later subraces than any of those which now occupy the Eastern world have been developed and evolved in what is now the Western world. So now the great wave of spirituality is sweeping back again towards the West. Ex Orient lax. From the East the light is coming. But the very use of that phrase indicates that it is moving westward. Some Western Americans are fond of a boastful expression, westward the star of empires takes its way. I am not concerned for the moment with the star of empire, but westward the great forces of spiritual energy and development are distinctly moving. And we have to be worthy, as it were, of that condition of things. We have to rise to meet it. If we properly appreciate our functions, they are much more dignified than at the first glance people believe. The Theosophical Society is charged with the great task of leading spiritual progress in the Western world. The Society is a nucleus which in future generations, at no very distant period, will be enormously expanded beyond its present conditions. Expanded, let us trust, by virtue of the fact that those who are now concerned with it will appreciate the duties incumbent on them, and act in a manner which may pave the way for that further development which undoubtedly is contemplated by higher powers as the program of the future. That can be carried out if we can respond adequately to the influence that they are radiating. That is the most important thought that I have to deal with just now, but there are one or two other minor matters having to do with misconceptions or misunderstandings of theosophical teaching, which seem trivial and almost trumpery compared with those which I have been talking about, but which none the less claim notice. I am referring to views which are sometimes put forward, connecting aspirations for spiritual growth and progress with questions relating to what we eat and drink or refrain from eating and drinking. Now this is a very delicate subject which has been a good deal discussed by theosophical writers lately, and in reference to which I am very anxious not to be misunderstood myself by theosophical friends. No one can entertain a more definitely appreciative admiration for what may roughly be called superior or cleaner modes of life, as compared with those of the multitude, than I myself. But I do venture to say, and I say it on authority that I respect, that however beautiful in its conception pure diet may be, that perfect way in diet that Mrs. Kingsford so admirably wrote about many years ago has nothing to do with spiritual progress. That is all that I am driving at. Do not let people who, whether for reasons of health, convenience, family environment, or for any other reasons worthy of consideration, find it difficult to adopt the rules of the perfect way in diet, do not let them suppose that in any way they are prejudicing their spiritual growth by disregarding them. That is all I am emphasizing. The all-important consideration in regard to physical life, I am not speaking now of the moral attributes that should guide our conduct in life, our all-important duty in regard to the physical instrument with which we have to work when we are trying to do the right thing in this life, is that we should keep it in health. And at the present time, when most of our bodies, not our egos, but most of our bodies, may have come down through a line of heredity familiarized with the old-fashioned diet, it does not always happen that the present representatives of that line can be healthy on an entirely new regime. That is the important point to remember. Your duty, so to speak, to the body is to keep it in health, and you must determine for yourself what particular course of life in regard to this matter of eating and drinking is best calculated to have that effect. I have made efforts to get information on this subject from exalted teachers. I think I have succeeded, and of course what I have been saying to you is the outcome of such success. Going more into detail, it may be recognized that in a certain very limited sense it is true that what, for want of a better term, we call magnetism of a bad order does attach to meat as a food. It has a very slight influence, and I am told that those who look on from a higher plane at the efforts of some vegetarian thinkers to follow the perfect way in diet, are rather amused to see that they ignore this question of magnetism as between various kinds of vegetable food. If there is any point in the idea that certain foods have a bad magnetism, then certain kinds of vegetable foods have a bad magnetism to just the same extent as meat, and in neither case does that matter seriously. The same thing applies to alcohol with slightly greater emphasis. And again the question is whether physical heredity is of such an order as to render any particular body incapable of maintaining health and efficiency for whatever work it has to do, without some little of that otherwise undesirable beverage. One other theory claims notice in this connection, that which relates to the habit of smoking. Let nobody be under the impression, if they are inclined to attach any importance to the information I have been privileged to obtain, that there is any harm in that practice in regard to the conditions it engenders in the physical body. In reference to health, to spiritual or moral progress, or to any of the loftier duties of life, it is perfectly harmless. It has no bad effect on astral or etheric conditions, in moderation of course. We always assume that we are talking to people who are not going to extremes in the pursuit of any pleasures of a physical order. But within reasonable limits that particular practice, I am told, has rather a beneficial effect than otherwise on the etheric conditions of people who live in modern communities, full of astral swirls of all kinds and of a complicated order. There remains only one other remark to make on this subject, that of course in reference to smoking, however agreeable and innocent it may be in itself. Nobody who is thinking along the lines that are probably operative with theosophical students would dream of doing anything of that kind in a manner which would be disagreeable to others. That is just the clue to the correct understanding of this matter. It hinges on to very much loftier principles. Because the idea that we should do nothing for our own sake which is injurious to the comfort or welfare of other people is a crude way of putting the fundamental conception which has to do with spiritual progress in all its aspects. We are not segregated atoms in consciousness, living only for our individual selves. We are simply parts of a stupendous design, the identity of ourselves with which at some future period we shall fully realize, as we may now even intellectually appreciate it. That idea can never be misunderstood, because of its utter simplicity. Simple on this plane, it is equally simple and equally true on planes above, and is the one idea which, if it thoroughly saturates our understanding, and becomes the guide of life and action, will render people theosophists in the truest acceptation of the term. The superphysical laws of nature. To speak of the change which has come over the public mind, or that portion of the public mind which represents the advanced culture of the period, as a movement of thought, is, in truth, to use an inadequate expression, for that movement is largely due to an inflow of new knowledge and information concerning the superphysical mysteries of nature, which were not at the disposal of those who, in the middle of the last century, represented the incredulity which then prevailed in reference to all matters having to do with mystic research. Those of us whose memories stretch back to the middle of the last century will remember how determined and contemptuous that incredulity generally was. To attain any knowledge concerning superphysical states of human consciousness was held to be eternally impossible. Sporadic phenomena, reported from time to time as indicating that it might be possible to obtain communication with the surviving consciousness of people who had departed this life, were treated as though of necessity they represented imposture and fraud. Stories of clairvoyance, and records of curious results obtained by mesmerism, fortune-telling, in all its curious varieties, whether concerned with cards, palmistry, or astrology, and all the confused traditions of medieval magic, were lumped up together as representing ignorant superstition. The science of the period, dealing exclusively with the phenomena of matter, with theories that could be substantiated by physical experiment, was enthroned in public esteem, not merely, as it deserved, by reason of representing a magnificent development of human intelligence, but as expressive of finality in regard to human knowledge. Not finality along the lines of its own activity, but finality as regards the character of such knowledge, held to be necessarily limited by the resources of physical sense. Philosophy even, vaguely conscious of something beyond the characteristics of matter, did not hesitate to describe whatever lay beyond the reach of physical research as unknowable. And those who ventured to attempt the exploration of the unseen or intangible mysteries of nature, did so at the expense of being treated with contempt by the orthodox opinion of their time. But without stopping to trace the steps by which the great change has been brought about, what is the actual state of things which we have now to recognize as distinguishing the thought of our own period? To begin with, those who feel themselves in possession of certain knowledge to the effect that it is possible to communicate with those who have passed on to other states of existence, are to be counted by millions both in Europe and America. Their conviction does not imply that it is always possible to command such communication in individual cases. The laws relating to all such methods are, as yet, but imperfectly understood. But the broad certainty that, under some circumstances, such communication is possible, is enough to establish the main principle that human consciousness survives the change called death. And it is impossible to overrate the value of the widespread conviction to that effect permeating our civilization, in which the progress of physical science was tending in the opposite direction, while the influence of religious teaching was insufficient to counteract that tendency. Concurrently with the growth of confidence in the main idea represented by spiritualism, the various manifestations of nature's finer forces operative amongst those still in physical life have been steadily securing attention. Psychic research became, by degrees, not merely emancipated from the intolerance it formerly encountered, but has been gradually established amongst us as almost a fashionable pursuit. Mesmerism, so fiercely flouted in the beginning, became recognized, in some of its aspects, at all events, as a curative agent in some conditions of disease. And though ill understood as yet by those who only know it under the modern and misleading designation, hypnotism, is actually recognized as a system of treatment by many orthodox practitioners. And, sharing in the growing changes of opinion, the fascination of fortune-telling in all its varieties has proved only too attractive to many enthusiasts of our generation. Finally, we have to recognize that in the scientific world itself, a few, at all events, of those most distinguished in research, and many indeed beside those who have had the courage to acknowledge their conviction, are conscious already that they are standing on the threshold of a new scientific dispensation, in which superphysical laws and superphysical faculties must be made available by those whose destiny it may be to expound the natural philosophy of the future. Problems connected with the ether, the electron, and unseen emanations from the sun, credited with the production of those curious phenomena known as magnetic storms, are all of them imperatively in need of illumination of a kind that can only be derived from superphysical investigation. The present situation is full of promise for developments, at no distant future, which will involve in the embrace of recognized science the resources and achievements of occultism. That is the change that has taken place within the last 25 or 30 years. Beyond the influence of spiritualism, to which I have already referred, what are the other influences which have brought it about? I am not eager to claim credit in any exclusive degree or to any predominant extent for the literature which, within the period to which I refer, has been devoted to the exposition of that teaching generally known as theosophy. But it would be affectation to suppose that the change has not been attributable, in some measure, to the wide diffusion of that clearly defined, coherent scientific interpretation of a vast body of natural law relating to human evolution which the literature of theosophy has put at the disposal of the cultured world since that system of teaching was first formulated in approximate detail. Whether it has been the cause or the effect of the great change in modern thought which I have been endeavoring to trace. No one who has adequately studied theosophical teaching will deny that for the first time in the overt history of human enlightenment it presents us with a complete theory of life. Reaching back to its beginnings, reaching forward to its possibilities, and incidentally foreshadowing the ultimate synthesis into a complete science of superphysical nature. Of all the miscellaneous phenomena with which psychic research is concerned, spiritualism established the reality of a future life, but aimed, I venture to think, as regards its original inspiration, at nothing more. Occult research, independently of spiritualism, has established the fact that human consciousness, still expressed in incarnation, has resources at its disposal far transcending in their significance the senses of the physical body. Theosophy, accepting and interpreting these conclusions, has illuminated, for our benefit, the whole scheme of human evolution, the laws governing spiritual progress, the possibilities awaiting mankind in a remote future. The continuity of life in successive manifestations on this physical plane of existence, and the growth of the soul, under the influence of the experience which those successive manifestations afford. No hurried phrases of this nature can adequately convey to minds, as yet unfamiliar with the literature of theosophy, a complete comprehension of its sublime significance. But in truth the teaching itself, when properly understood, enables us to realize that everyone who aspires sooner or later to realize the potentialities of human progress must absorb that teaching into his consciousness as a necessary preparation for the efforts he will be called upon to make, in connection with his ulterior development. This statement may seem extravagant, but will be readily appreciated by those who have studied, with any degree of earnestness, the fundamental principles of human evolution rendered apparent by the teaching of the higher occultism. Ignoring detail, we are able to perceive the whole scheme of human evolution as divided into two mighty halves. During the first of which the forces of nature carry forward the human ego to a stage of development fairly represented by the average culture of our own time. But the subtle forces generated by the ego itself are essential to ulterior progress during the second great half of the evolutionary period. And these cannot be brought into activity without a clear comprehension of the design they are intended to subserve. To the halfway period of the whole journey, nature brings us without claiming any help from ourselves. The next half of the journey can only be accomplished by the union of our own enlightened will with the forces which nature will still contribute to assist us in our upward growth. The phrase I have employed as the title of this essay may not at once be intelligible, but if I had not shrunk from expanding it to inconvenient length, I should have rendered it more unintelligible still by employing the words used with a double signification, proposing to deal, not merely with the superphysical aspect of natural forces, but also with the natural aspect of superphysical forces. The inversion of the phrase may not at once convey a specific meaning, but I venture to think that before I have done its significance will be clearly appreciated. And in order that what I have to say may be at once intelligible in its bearing on the main idea, let me explain very concisely at the outset the conclusions I shall endeavor to reach. I want to show, first of all, that the forces with which we are all familiar, in their relationship with matter, the laws of nature as they are commonly called, can only be correctly understood if we think of them as the expression of divine will consciously operating to produce the effects we observe, and, secondly, that while the effects we observe, in connection with the consequences of action, with all that has to do with our appreciation of right and wrong, good and evil, and moral principle, can readily enough be associated with the idea of divine will, embodying sanction or disapproval. They are none the less to be recognized as a vast department of natural law, which, though dealing with resources of a superphysical nature beyond the reach of experimental research, constitute none the less a department of natural law as uniform and definite as those which have to do with the behavior of matter. We find ourselves in this world, under conditions which enable us to recognize it as an arena of spiritual evolution. But it is even more obviously an arena of a complicated system of law relating to physical matter, and in reference to this great body of law we may even extend our observation beyond the limits within which, as a rule, I think it wise to confine our attention. In presence of attempts sometimes made to interpret or speculate concerning the origin and divine government of the whole universe, I have often ventured to suggest that it is unwise to do more than endeavor to comprehend the origin and purpose of our own solar system. At the best, in reference to that, we can never hope to do more than obtain fragmentary conceptions, and dimly to picture in the mind the story of its origin and the theory of its final perfection. But in reference to physical law we are enabled to perceive that the code which is manifestly operative in the solar system is certainly, to some extent, possibly in its entirety, applicable to the innumerable systems distributed through the infinitudes of space. It is certain, for example, that the fundamental law of gravitation, governing all masses of matter within our view, is also operative in distant systems of a wholly different order where a dual or multiple system of suns can be distinctly observed as obedient to the law which governs the motion of our own planets in their orbits. And beyond this the resources of spectroscopic observation enable us to identify, in distant suns, some of the varieties under which matter manifests itself to us in our laboratories, and to speculate, not unreasonably, on the probability that the so-called chemical elements with which we are acquainted here are also the materials of which distant solar systems are constructed, and which, most probably, are obedient in such systems to the same laws of chemical affinity that we are enabled to investigate in handling those elements on Earth. The value of this observation has to do, of course, with the manner in which it tends to suggest an otherwise unrecognizable unity in the whole cosmos, even if it is hardly profitable for us to pursue that idea much farther. But whether we think of the natural laws affecting matter in their cosmic or in their more limited aspect, we cannot but be equally driven to the conclusion that the divine power, which builds up definite worlds and systems, impresses on the complex organisms thus created the characteristics they exhibit when the creation is accomplished. Along the lines of ordinary astronomical speculation, as also by the light of esoteric teaching, we are enabled to formulate a broad conception of the manner in which the worlds of a system like our own are built up by the aggregation in the first instance of relatively homogeneous matter available throughout space. Astronomy deals with the development of suns and planets, from nebulae. Occult teaching follows along somewhat the same path, though going back a little earlier in the story, and recognizing the formation of the nebulae as the result of divine will operating on the infinite expanse of etheric substance. But whether we imagine that by virtue of laws pervading the universe, etheric matter when aggregated into physical molecules is inherently invested with the power of endowing those molecules with the attributes we recognize in the chemical elements, or whether we imagine a will which, by the first hypothesis, emanates from some cosmic influence, to be reproduced by the will of the divine power to which our system is directly due, the same conclusion emerges from either hypothesis. The attributes of matter, constituting in their entirety that which we describe as the laws of nature, are the expression of divine will either consciously operating throughout the universe directly, or indirectly passed on through the will of the divine beings to whom the existence of each solar system is due. And apart from the general force of reasonable speculation along these lines, I have been incidentally assured that clairvoyant observation of a high order will confirm this conclusion in a curious and interesting way. To render this suggestion intelligible we must remember, of course, that wherever we speak of divine will operating in regions of nature within our own purview, we have to understand that it operates through a vast hierarchy of subordinate agency. Such agency has, of course, to be recognized as associated with varieties of spiritual evolution quite independent of the human kingdom. And in dealing with these, we are, of course, moving through a region of thought in which manifestation is obscure, and observation extremely difficult. But nonetheless, I have known it to be asserted by qualified observers whom I have been disposed to trust, that where important researches, connected with some of the great laws of nature, have been in progress, beings of some superhuman order have actually been present, watching or perhaps guiding the progress of human enlightenment in connection with the departments of nature it is their duty to preside over. If this be actually the case, it serves to emphasize the main idea with which I am at present concerned, the direct bearing of conscious will on the laws of matter, which, at cruder stages of human thought, the science of the period contrived to regard as compatible with an atheistic contempt for all conceptions relating to a divine origin. That worship of matter per se which characterized a certain variety of scientific thought, in the last century, is no less ludicrously discredited by the illuminated intelligence represented by the higher occultism than the equally crude conception of primitive theology which, while certainly recognizing divine power as a factor in the universe, assumed to be operative in a way which we now perceive to be as little in harmony with the truth of things as the grosser materialistic belief. The notion that the divine being does no more than pronounce a word, in order that natural phenomena shall be evoked, fully armed, ex nihilo, is hardly less absurd, hardly less derogatory to the nature of divinity than the opposite belief that matter existed from the eternity of the past and can, by its own combinations, give rise to human consciousness. Even our comprehension of the natural machinery by means of which physical effects are produced may serve, for instance, to put a new complexion on the meaning of the familiar expression, "Let there be light." That the sensation in human consciousness of light is an expression of divine will, is emphatically one of the ideas I am eager to emphasize, but we know that the result is produced by the complicated mechanism of etheric vibration. And that divinity had a more complicated task to perform, in providing for the sensation of light, than would have been evolved in the simple utterance of a decree. The behavior of the ether, in conveying vibrations from distant sources of light, to the planets requiring illumination, is complicated to that degree that our investigations, as yet, have but vaguely hinted at some of its complexities. But the illustration serves to suggest the way in which the results aimed at in creation are obtained by what, relatively to early theological belief, must be regarded as elaborate and laborious methods. Methods, almost certainly, associated with a stupendous hierarchy of subordinate agencies reflecting the divine will at every stage of the process. But so far I have been dealing only with half the idea I want to convey. That which is, in a certain sense, the least important half, because it involves ideas which, independently of occult research, will probably be found floating in the thought of the period, though perhaps, in most cases, more vaguely than when clarified by a broad and comprehensive appreciation of the world's evolution, as a whole. The expansion of the idea into the region of intangible cause and effect, is certainly not yet familiar to ordinary psychological speculation. But, to begin with, all of us who have been appreciative of theosophical teaching on the comprehensive scale, will be familiar with the idea that what is known as the law of karma, is a law operative on the moral plane. As definitely as the law of gravitation controls the region of physical manifestation. But that law is generally thought of as a vague expression of divine will. And even with such opportunity as may be furnished by familiarity, in some cases, with the evolution of specific egos through a long series of lives. Though it is exceeding difficult to recognize it as working with the regularity so plainly observable when we are dealing with the laws of physical nature, nevertheless, we do broadly recognize the idea that conduct in life of a specific order is productive of definite consequences, following an inevitable rule, and not subject in each case to specific judgments resembling those of a human autocrat. None the less, however, when we think of karma, good or bad, as operative to produce agreeable or painful conditions in the life or lives following any action in question, it is difficult to get out of the habit of thinking that the ego concerned has somehow been the subject of a judgment. The physical laws of nature seem so fundamentally welded with matter that it is only with a mental effort we can comprehend them as in truth the expression of a conscious will emanating from, or reflected from, conscious will on some level of divine existence. On the other hand, the moral aspects of conduct, the rightness or wrongness of specific action, suggest instinctively the idea that their conformity, or nonconformity, with the intentions of God, is the explanation of their rightness or their wrongness. In this case a mental effort is required to establish the conception that that divine will is so marvelously penetrating and precise in its operation that it cannot any longer be thought of as due, so to speak, to capricious spasms of admiration or disapproval, but is as uniform in its operation as the law of gravitation, as complex in its character as the laws of chemical affinity. It is law, enacted once for all and applicable to all conceivable varieties of circumstances. The conception with which we are thus inevitably faced by a profound study of the whole subject, is that the whole scheme of morals, in the broadest acceptation of that term, is governed by a body of law as comprehensive as the law of gravitation. As detailed as those which are studied in chemical laboratories, where the will of God, in reference to matter, is investigated by experiment and even guided, by the free will of man, towards purposes we may desire to subserve. And just as the physical law is operative, not merely with great masses of matter, but with microscopic morsels, or even with ultramicroscopic particles, so the moral law can penetrate the smallest crevices of our moral nature. Dealing as appropriately with the pettiest shortcomings, with the feeblest aspirations upward, as with the grandest achievements of philanthropy or the foulest varieties of crime. It must be allowed that we cannot easily escape from old habits of thought, nor give up the trick of thinking of any peculiar faculty we may possess as a gift of nature. Of any suffering we may be called upon to endure as a chastisement inflicted by a divine master for our good. We retain, in many cases, even the habit of regarding our daily bread as something which is given to us this day, and for which it is decent, on our part, to return thanks, as we sit down to table. Such habits of thought are pretty and harmless in their place, for people who do not care to penetrate, with open eyes, into the mysteries of life. Who are content with the simplicities of a reverent attitude and unconsciously content to wait till a later opportunity for realizing that nothing can excite a more profoundly reverential attitude of mind than a clear vision, reaching in, or up, to the actual truth of things. But the occult student need not be the slave of any tradition, however useful it may have been in its time, and if the idea I am endeavoring to suggest is rightly apprehended. It can never present itself to any mind as at war with the reverential spirit. On the contrary, it is calculated to enhance our reverence for the divine power above, when we realize that the wisdom that guides its exercise is sufficiently profound, extensive, and penetrating to formulate laws which deal with all the varieties of moral condition to which the free will of mankind, an essential factor in spiritual evolution, can possibly give rise. Nor when the almost infinite resources of free will within the domain of law are recognized, will the recognition of an all-pervading system of moral law be, in any way, confusion to the mind. At the present stage of average human development, that element of free will within human nature is hardly illuminated with sufficient knowledge to render it capable, so to speak, of steering a chosen path through the complexities of the law. But the law, itself, provides compensation for the embarrassments of ignorance while ignorance prevails, at the same time that it provides opportunity for the exercise of free will, when at a later stage more enlightened knowledge shall guide its exercise. Nor even need we cast aside the early anthropomorphic conception of divinity which appealed to the saintship of a more primitive age, and responded to the spiritual thirst of humanity for a divine object of worship, sufficiently like ourselves to excite adoration and love. We who are, at present, concerned with the attempt to comprehend the meaning of the higher occultism, may be embarrassed, for a time, by finding it impossible to retain anthropomorphic conceptions of divinity while, as yet, our knowledge is insufficient to picture in imagination the divinity which, in some mysterious fashion, is at once, as it were, the fountain of the love principle and the destination of that principle as it works in our own nature. To suppose that the higher occultism, because it puts aside some of the crude fancies of humanity's childhood, embodies a hard, cold, or unsympathetic conception of divine rule, is to misunderstand its whole significance more deplorably almost than this unfortunate result can be accomplished by any other misunderstanding. The essence of many religious conceptions may still be retained in our thought, even when their ecclesiastical presentation is put from us as out of date, and the complete grasp of the ideas I have been endeavoring, in the course of this essay, to suggest, thoughts so subtle that their clear presentation is a matter of extreme difficulty, will, for example, help to emphasize, rather than to discredit, one of the most beautiful phrases that can be borrowed from the literature of early religion. For our free will, with the help of improved enlightenment, may enable us, in conformity with the reign of law on the moral plane, to vindicate the profound truth that free will, itself, is an element of divinity within our own nature. A power which may render us, each in our turn, capable, in a certain sense, of rising above all law, constrained though we may be, by relative insignificance, to obey it for a time. I do not mean that any free will of man can countervail any detail of the moral law pervading the system to which we belong. But just as a clear comprehension of physical law enables us to work out results on the physical plane, of which we may be definitely regarded as the authors, so the ultimate comprehension of the loftier law will enable us. That figure of speech be permissible, to ascend to regions of existence in which we shall transcend its operation, vindicating the old familiar phrase, in my mind a moment ago. That in divinity itself, not merely in the sphere of manifestation on which our potentialities may be developed, we live and move and have our being. The higher occultism. The instruction given in ancient Greece to those who took part in the meetings at Eleusis, celebrated in history as the Eleusinian Mysteries, related, as we have abundant reason to believe, to superphysical knowledge concerning the higher planes of nature, of the kind that has been freely promulgated amongst us in recent years. Such knowledge is that with which we are engaged in our study of the higher occultism. The eager pursuit of superphysical knowledge has been a leading characteristic of civilized intelligence for the last 50 years. Within which time multitudes have come to know that communication between this plane of life and that to which humanity passes after the death of the body is possible. But the great movement, having a wider scope than that which, important as its influence has been, is narrow to the consideration of experiences immediately following the physical life. The study of the higher occultism with which we are now concerned, originated with the Theosophical Society, the branches of which spread now over the whole world. This society was, at all events as regards this country, the channel through which recent enlightenment has been poured. And thus it becomes necessary to glance back over the history of the current movement in order to appreciate the importance of the work it has been privileged to accomplish, as also in order to appreciate the dignity of the task which lies before it. And to do this effectually it is necessary to look back even farther than to those earlier beginnings of modern civilization when the knowledge that we have been enabled to handle so freely was already in the possession of a few, but guarded for these few, in accordance with what was then held to be an imperative necessity, by secrecy of the most rigid order. At a period long anterior to the establishment of the Eleusinian Mysteries, similar teaching was undoubtedly conveyed to students of occultism attached to Egyptian temples. And what we know now enables us to realize that there never has been a time in the history of mankind during which the evolving race was left entirely without guidance from those by whom the great laws governing the whole evolution were correctly understood. In the childhood of the race, indeed, as we are now in a position to apprehend so clearly, such knowledge was only possessed by representatives of a more advanced evolution, trusted, under divine providence, with the regulation of the whole undertaking, with the nurture and education of the new race of which they were in charge. But gradually, as the more advanced representatives of this race attained something resembling maturity of intelligence, a few amongst them, qualified by exceptionally rapid advancement, were privileged to share in the wisdom of their preceptors. In this way, without having any detailed knowledge of the manner in which the progress was accomplished, we can appreciate, without the least shadow of uncertainty, the way in which the initiated adepts of our own human family first became organized as a distinct association, qualified by degrees to assume the responsibilities originally belonging to the representatives of the superior race whose contact with humanity is dimly suggested in history by vague traditions of divine kings. But for many millenniums the adepts of our humanity held it to be premature to share their wisdom with the indiscriminate multitude. The occult student is enabled to appreciate the considerations which induce them to maintain this reserve. All knowledge in varying degrees, according to its importance, is associated with varying degrees of moral responsibility. Putting the idea in language with which most of us are now familiar, the karma of action, distinctly at variance with the loftier purposes of spiritual evolution. becomes terribly emphasized when such action is realized by the agent as in conflict with the divine purpose. This idea is susceptible of elaborate expansion. But in its simplest form is the vindication of that policy of secrecy as applied to superphysical knowledge which some of us familiar with the publicity rightly attached to the progress of discovery in physical science are sometimes disposed to resent. Dealing, however, for the moment merely with the course of events, we have to recognize that all information accessible to human research connected with those higher planes of nature, concerning which we are now able to speak so freely, was as a matter of fact guarded from public dissemination by the vows which, until very recently, precluded an initiate from disclosing the secrets of initiation. But we are now enabled to realize that knowledge formerly included amongst the secrets of initiation is knowledge of a kind which, sooner or later, every human being must possess as a condition providing for his progress along the path of evolution marked out for him by the great design. To appreciate the true importance of that higher occultism with the study of which we are now concerned, it is necessary that the full significance of the idea I have just endeavored to express should be grasped by everyone who takes part in such work as that we have now in hand. Earlier impressions with reference to the teaching conferred on students of occultism in former ages, are generally to the effect that such teaching must have been intensely interesting. That it invested the possessor with powers of a kind unfamiliar to ordinary life, that it was something so desirable in itself that no personal sacrifices were allowed to stand in the way of those who aspired to it, that no perils daunted them, that no temptations of a worldly nature could turn them aside from its pursuit. All such conceptions were perfectly sound as far as they went, but they failed entirely to interpret the great primary motive that inspired those who pursued occult knowledge with a correct appreciation of all that its acquisition signified. It is true that the adept and, in a lesser degree, those who are advancing along the path leading to adeptship, acquire knowledge of transcendent interest, and powers the dignity of which cannot easily be exaggerated. But these rewards are not those which the enlightened aspirant for adeptship is seeking in his long and laborious efforts to make progress in that direction. That which he soon learns to realize, if morally capable of continuous advance along the path he has chosen, is suggested by the simple truth that the path leading to adeptship is the condensed epitome of the whole design which divine wisdom has sketched out on an enormous scale for the ultimate progress of all humanity. The supreme achievements of adeptship establish those who attain it on the moral, intellectual, and spiritual level which represents the culmination of all that is possible for the human race as such. Occult science is so concatenated altogether in its vast entirety, that these great truths can only be fully grasped by those who have completely assimilated the teaching now available for all of us who care to profit by it, concerning the whole design in which the human race is involved. But all who have profited effectually by the literature of modern occultism will be in a position to appreciate the force of what I have just said, and even those who as yet are merely approaching the great study, under the influence of that sympathetic feeling for it now so widely diffused, will no doubt be able to catch the significance of the fundamental truth I have endeavored to express, and will thus be ready to perceive the manner in which the study of the conditions leading up towards adeptship casts a flood of light upon the future progress of the human race. While conversely, the study of the teaching we have been privileged to receive concerning the future destinies of the race, will invest progress towards adeptship with a dignity far greater than that assigned to it at an earlier period of thought, by observers who merely supposed that it was aimed at for the sake of its knowledge and its power. Reverting now to the course of events, we have to begin by contemplating the attitude of the advanced occultist towards the world at large, at a period anterior to the recent outburst of specific teaching. Of course it was obvious to those already on adept levels at any period of the past to which we may look back, that sooner or later the knowledge they so jealously guarded would have to be disseminated broadcast throughout the world. But their knowledge also enabled them to perceive that the whole stupendous scheme of human evolution was susceptible of division into two great halves. It has been the task of modern interpreters of occultism to describe the characteristics of these two great phases of evolution in considerable detail. And we know that throughout the first half of the process, frequently described as the downward arc of evolution, the divine purpose was gradually fulfilled by the differentiation of the diffused spiritual energy animating the undertaking into specific centers of consciousness, these constituting, when developed, human egos, qualified to accumulate experience through a long course of successive incarnations, and gradually to arrive, in that way, at the midway station of the whole great journey, with no other duty, so to speak, up to that time, than those relating to their own individualization, to their acquisition of strength and capacity as separated entities each conscious of its own interests. Looking back indeed to earlier races of mankind anterior even to that mighty Atlantean race immediately preceding our own, we may realize, almost with surprise, from our present point of view, that the most sublime virtue we now are qualified to admire, and some of us perhaps, in some degree, qualified to aspire to, the virtue of unselfishness, did not even dawn as a conception on the human mind in the beginning. On the contrary, there was a stage, during the progress of humanity along the downward arc, when selfishness was the law of progress, of such progress as was then desired in accordance with the divine purpose. But from the midway stage of human evolution onwards, new conceptions of right and wrong became possible. Of course the midway stage was not reached by the whole human race simultaneously, but a considerable number of millions may have been standing fairly in the front. By the time the Atlantean race had lived through half the period of the life assigned to it, and from that period onward, it became theoretically possible for those members of the human family who had most completely fulfilled the program of nature up to that time to appreciate the loftier purposes of the further evolution awaiting them during the second half of the great evolutionary process, during the upward arc leading towards divine perfection. We do not know with precision how soon it became theoretically possible for the most advanced members of our own family to receive, from the superior teachers who preceded them, the knowledge which we now handle so freely and describe as the higher occultism. But at all events, during the latter half of the Atlantean race some members of our own human family were enabled to appreciate the lofty design sketched out for their advancement, to detach themselves from the chaotic throng of their self-seeking contemporaries, and to establish here and there, even in that early world, centers of initiation from which their influence began in a faint, diluted fashion to radiate through the world, and towards which those whose spontaneous interior progress had invested them with appropriate qualifications were drawn into the paths of higher knowledge. But millenniums had to accumulate until thousands were no longer adequate to record the progress of the years, before the adept fraternity could contemplate the possibility of disseminating the wisdom they possessed broadcast through the world. Some elevated moral principles, as the progress of mankind along the upward arc proceeded, were of a kind which it was possible to convey with safety to the multitude. And that possibility found its expression in the foundation of all the great religions of the world which have emanated, as we see now without the possibility of mistake, from the wisdom of early adeptship. That suggestion need not be held at variance with the belief which assigns a divine origin to some religions of the kind referred to. Divine purposes are worked out in all cases through subordinate agencies, and the comprehension of this, in many ways, is one of the illuminating discoveries that we are enabled to reach through the study of occultism. But at all events, those who appreciate the spiritual and educational blessings conferred on humanity by religion may readily erect on that primary belief the further conception that at a certain stage of human progress specific knowledge of spiritual science may, without offending against the dignity of religion, be superadded to it. And what we know now is that for some centuries, adept observers of human growth in this fifth race of ours, the first beyond the Atlantean on the upward arc of evolution, have been on the watch for indications which may show that an adequate number of those left hitherto to the simpler influence and guidance of religious thought might become qualified for the reception in its entirety, or at all events, in considerable measure, of that spiritual science from which religion, in the first instance, had its rise. We can see now, looking back 100, 200, or even 300 years, that some experiments were made by the adept experts of this science, to ascertain whether amongst ordinary humanity people were ripe for higher teaching in a sufficient degree to justify its public dissemination. To trace the details of these experiments would be a considerable task by itself, which indeed some of us have attempted to carry out by studying the life histories of distinguished occultists throughout the Middle Ages. But passing over that, for the moment, we have to recognize that until our own time such experiments were held to be unsuccessful. And so we come at last, along the train of thought I have been following, to an intelligent comprehension of the circumstances that prompted the recent outburst of teaching from adept sources. That teaching embodied in the earliest theosophical books was itself experimental in its inception, but unlike previous attempts of a similar character, was crowned with success. Sufficient numbers of people in the modern world, or leaving out of account whatever has been done in the East, I may fairly say in this modern European world of ours, have shown themselves entitled, by the readiness of their appreciation, to receive occult teaching in such abundant volume, that we stand now in a position, in that respect, of intellectual advancement, far exceeding the corresponding position reached by those who, as a privilege individually earned and guarded by vows of secrecy, were taught something of the higher occultism when the mysteries were celebrated at Eleusis. The objects of the Theosophical Society. Theosophical Brotherhood. From time to time we may usefully review the gradually improving conceptions we have been enabled to form concerning the grand purposes underlying the Theosophical movement. The phrases in which these were ultimately crystallized do not, though this matters little, reflect the ideas present to the minds of those who, in 1875, did actually, in a certain sense, found the Society. At that time it was the result of interest excited among a small group of persons frequenting Madame Blavatsky's rooms in New York, by the exhibition of her wonderful occult powers. As Colonel Olcott explains in his diary, a lecture was given in September, 1875, at Madame Blavatsky's rooms by a certain Mr. Felt, of whom we lose sight afterwards, on the adept magic of Egyptian priests. Colonel Olcott then suggested the formation of a society to study this subject. That was done, and though the title, Theosophical, was adopted, doubtless under occult guidance, Colonel Olcott at one time proposed to call it a Miracle Club. The word brotherhood does not creep into its records till some years later. It was first used by Mr. C. Massey and his friends in London when they formed a British branch of the New York Society. They described its purpose as being, to discover the nature and powers of the human soul, and they went on to declare that they believed in a great intelligent first cause and in the divine sonship of the spirit of man. And hence in the immortality of that spirit and in the universal brotherhood of the human race. Colonel Olcott took this hint and developed the idea in a new statement of subjects as follows: 1. The study of occult science, 2. The formation of a nucleus of universal brotherhood, 3. The revival of Oriental literature. The word brotherhood was afterwards shifted into the first place, but it was always accompanied by the qualifying term nucleus. It was not used, and should never be used, by theosophists with the significance attached to it by those concerned with mundane politics or social reconstruction on the physical plane. The word in its theosophical meaning refers to the unity of divine consciousness on lofty planes of nature, and to the nucleus for the reflection of that unity on the physical plane that may be formed by theosophical students who appreciate the teaching aright. The gross democratic meaning attached to the term brotherhood is an insult to theosophical teaching. The consciousness which expands into perfected humanity is, no doubt, in a subtle metaphysical sense identical in its nature with the consciousness, not merely of the humbler classes in civilized countries, but with that also of the crocodile, the dog, the Australian savage, and the master of wisdom. But this does not mean that all manifested consciousness in whatever vehicle we find it is, therefore, invested with equal claims on our respect. It is invested with equal claims on our sympathy, and that is how people who do not appreciate subtle distinctions drift into the misuse of the term brotherhood. If the sheep and the guinea pig are included in the universal brotherhood, well and good, but we do not ask the sheep and the guinea pig to contribute their opinions to discussions of the suffrage question, for example. And that thought is a clue to the fallacy involved in regarding theosophical brotherhood as leading to political socialism. Theosophical teaching concerning human evolution shows us the human family at present at very different stages of development. It rescues us from the old-fashioned blunder, arising from the ignorant delusion that each new child is a new creation, to the effect that all have equal rights. According to a phrase classical in political writing, all are equally entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but with very varied claims on the privilege of shaping laws providing for the fulfillment of that fundamental idea. Thus, to let the formula in which the objects of the Theosophical Society are generally expressed distort the purpose of the movement to suit the purpose of any mundane theory of social reform is a very grievous blunder. From the beginning all qualified exponents of the Theosophical movement have warned us to keep clear of all political contamination. The society may include persons of very varied political opinions. But within the society their only duty is to study and promote the study of the superphysical spiritual science gradually unfolded for our benefit and through us for the benefit of all mankind. The fulfillment of that duty should be compatible with perfect harmony of feeling within the society, where it is needless and undesirable to discuss varied beliefs as to how the physical welfare of the community may be best promoted. We should not furnish unsympathetic critics of our real work with an excuse for pretending to regard us as a body of people entangled with questionable schemes for subversive changes on the physical plane. 2. The study of comparative religions. By those who concern themselves with it, this second object is liable to be misunderstood. By a large number it is disregarded. It has a very definite purpose really. Briefly stated, that is, to bring out by such study the fact that at the basis of all religions worth talking of there are certain fundamental ideas, more or less vaguely hinted at, which are clearly set forth in theosophical teaching. Theosophical writers have sometimes too emphatically emphasized the idea that theosophy is not a religion. Of course it is not, in the sense that it has no hard and fast creed of the kind that most religions adopt. But no one who really understands theosophical teaching is in need of any other religion. A real comprehension of the divine hierarchy, and of the laws governing human evolution, covers the whole area of thought and emotion which any religion at its best can cover, besides covering a good deal more. Not on that account will any true theosophist repudiate any religion with which by race or nationality he may be traditionally connected. Here we have a very pretty subtlety to consider. If any theosophist identified by race, residence, and habits of thought with this country is asked the question, "Are you a Christian?" what should he answer? To say, no, because in his inner consciousness he felt that occult wisdom superseded all religions having a definite name, would be misleading and in bad taste. My answer in such a case would be, certainly, of course I am. I might go on to explain that I had 110 sympathy with the caricature of Christianity provided for us by most of the European churches, but that would only be possible if the conversation were protracted. The idea to enforce is, that anyone who takes up any particular religion and makes a close study of that, embellishing its crudities as far as he can by the results of his own thinking, is not doing anything which resembles the fulfillment of the second object of the society. On the contrary, he is pressing against it. The more he succeeds in recommending to respect and attention any particular religion in preference to others, the more he is tending to defeat the second object of the society. The grand underlying purpose of which, veiled rather than fully expressed by the formal enumeration of objects, is to convey to the large numbers of people now fit to receive it the magnificent volume of knowledge concerning spiritual truth hitherto in the exclusive possession of the elder brethren of humanity. This could not have been done at a much earlier period. Clumsy religions, brutal bigotry, atheism, the result of disgust developed among the most intelligent by the stupidity of priests and clergy, all stood in the way. But the experiment was made in these latter years, and has been justified by partial success. Multitudes all over the world do appreciate the gift of occult knowledge. Of course, besides these, many rush in without understanding the real purpose of the movement, caught by some phrase associated with it, into which they read their own prepossessions. They may impede the progress of the great work for a time, but there are forces behind this that must prevail in the end. Far beyond the limits of the society the fascination of occult teaching is spreading through the cultured classes. To that growth we must look forward with confident hope, even if we, or some of us, get a little out of patience with mistaken ideas permeating the society at this early stage of its existence. The Theosophical movement is much bigger than the Theosophical Society, which must undergo great purification if it is, in future years, destined to lead the Theosophical movement. The movement itself is pressing towards a period when advanced thinkers will not be comparing medieval religions, but will be comparing whichever of these appeals best to their sympathies. With the grand spiritual truths conveyed to them by the Theosophical revelation, recasting their favorite religion, if they cling to it at all, in harmony with these truths. At the end there will be many who find in the teaching which we still call occult all the religion they need. Others will prefer to decorate it with some of the phraseology of their earlier faith. Thus ceremonial religions will survive by their various names, and in the midst of all there will be a central block of thinkers, more or less indifferent to ceremonial, who will be content to call themselves Theosophists, pure and simple. But the same ideas will permeate all groups, and great progress will then have been made in the development of that brotherhood, the nucleus of which we, who understand our task, are called upon to form at this commencement of the stupendous religious construction, the beautiful results of which those adequately gifted with foresight can discern beyond the horizon. 3. The powers latent in man. The third object of the society is less liable to be misunderstood than either the first or second, but is perhaps the most important, and, like any other idea expressed in concise language, is open to various interpretations. It is formally stated in these terms, to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. These words properly understood may be held to inaugurate the study of an entirely new science. The mistake sometimes made is to suppose that they merely prescribe an attempt to cultivate hitherto undeveloped faculties theoretically latent in each of us. That, in most cases, would prove an extremely unsatisfying or disappointing pursuit. Most people of this age and race have come into the present life without the potentiality of such development in themselves. As with every other attribute we possess, the potentiality of psychic perception can only exist as the product of some effort made in a former life. Many Theosophists accept and block the theory of karma, and at once proceed to ignore it when they think of themselves. They are too often encouraged to do this by people endowed with psychic faculties who find these so natural and easily used that they cannot help thinking that anyone might acquire them by working for that end with sufficient earnestness of purpose. Volumes, reckoning such writing in the aggregate, have been written to assure candidates for psychic development that if they will only lead the life, be ascetics in the matter of food, drink, etc., etc., they will be able to verify theosophical teaching for themselves. One might just as well tell a weak, undersized boy that by searing underdone beefsteaks and using the dumbbells he would make himself able to go into the ring and beat a prizefighter. The boy's karma has not endowed him with an athletic body, and he must be content to use it for pursuits it is adapted to deal with. Of course it is true that there are cases in which partially endowed persons may greatly stimulate their latent faculties. It is only a question of their karmic condition. There are all degrees of this condition to consider. At one end of the scale we have people who are naturally psychic from childhood onwards, and who, if they take pains, develop into great clairvoyants and seers in mature life. At the other end of the scale we have those who, however gifted intellectually, morally, and physically, have no glimmering of psychic faculty and could not develop that even if they made the struggle to do so the passion of a lifetime and ruined their health by asceticism. Between those two extremes there are all varieties of condition. And in some of these appropriate effort may give rise to results. I will only add, as a personal conviction, that in no cases will the results ensue from fanatical rules about eating and drinking. The finest clairvoyants and psychics I have known, and I have been privileged to know a good many, are people who laugh at all such rules and eat whatever they find by experience keeps them in the best health. I am assured on high authority that is the only sound rule to work with. Our bodies are the instruments we have to make use of in this life, and whatever work we have to do, we can do it best by keeping the instrument in good order. It should go without saying that no one worth talking about makes pleasure the test of what is best for him to eat or drink. But if it is useless for most people even to think of cultivating latent faculties in themselves, how does the third object affect them? In an extremely important way. The world at large knows nothing of the conditions that have been reached by some members of the human family, that may be reached eventually by all in some future life, and the work which theosophists are privileged to carry on is the dissemination of the knowledge on this subject which they, if they avail themselves of the opportunities for study which the theosophical movement has provided, are in a position to promote. The laws governing the gradual development of latent faculties in the human family to which we belong constitute a mighty science. I have said that we cannot all make ourselves clairvoyant, but we can all, if we take advantage of our opportunities, become proficient theoretically in that science, able to help on multitudes of others so far less privileged than ourselves. And that is certainly one way, I lean to think it is the only way, in which people who in the current life are beginning to be anxious about their latent faculties can really provide for their growth. Amplifying the above generalities, the first thing the true theosophist has got to do is to understand the goal to be aimed at, in other words, the place in nature. The condition and powers and functions of those whom we speak of now as masters of the White Lodge. I do not much like the phrase, but it will serve for the moment. In the early days of the movement we were all led to say to people thinking of joining the society, it does not matter whether you believe in the Adept Brotherhood or not. And it did not matter then. We felt that membership in the society would surely lead them sooner or later to acquire this essential belief. If it does not, they might really employ their energies elsewhere to better advantage. Do my readers realize, I wonder, how it came to pass that esoteric Buddhism sent a thrill through the world on its first appearance? That was not merely or chiefly because the sketch it gave of occult science met an intellectual need, but because it made people think of the great adepts, and that gave them a chance of driving home a return current of thought. They cannot begin such intercourse. The first appeal must come from the aspiring human ego. But once that aspiration is kindled, any results may ensue. Now, of course, those who profit by later theosophical literature may learn much more about the masters than they could gather from the first book. That, like every other theosophical book I have ever looked at, is replete with imperfection, for we who endeavor to interpret the rudiments of occult science are working on the threshold of infinity. But there is much known now that was quite unknown to the early leaders of the movement, about the White Lodge and the methods of approach to it, and those are the subjects and ideas people should concern themselves with if they desire, in an intelligent way, to carry out our third object, to investigate the laws of nature governing the development of the faculties and powers latent in man. The borderland of science. Astronomy, overt and occult. Nebula. An intelligent survey of our present knowledge and theories concerning nebulae seems to have been given lately to an American Astronomical Society, by a Mr. Vincent Francis, and I find it reprinted in Popular Astronomy. The paper is illustrated by a fine photograph of the spiral nebula in Coma Berenices, which happens to show very clearly a condition of nebular growth that I have insisted upon before now, and which is entirely supported by the writer I am quoting. You can see in the photograph how the central sun is condensing first before the spirals break up into planets. The contrary view was the defect of the grand original Laplace discovery. Laplace conceived the nebula to condense gradually from the outside, rings being formed, the outermost first, the central sun being left to the last. By degrees it was perceived that this would be a very unnaturelike process. It was putting the cart before the horse or the child before the parent. Mr. Francis more properly talks of the parent sun in discussing nebular growth. This whole department of astronomy has only been evolved since the development of the telescope. One may almost say, since the Huggins discovery that some nebulas give a purely gaseous spectrum, making it certain that they were not star clusters. Since then we have got on rapidly. It was found, indeed, that some nebula, certainly not resolvable into clusters, gave continuous spectra. Some consisted of glowing gas and some of solid particles. Then it became apparent that most probably all nebulas were spiral in their shape, and we approached the conception that central suns were formed before the planets. Then, again with the help of Sir William Huggins, we got at a means of ascertaining the motion of nebulae in the line of sight. It is an old story now, but fascinating as ever. The dark lines in the spectra of stars are sometimes displaced a little as compared with those of similar bodies in the laboratory. If they are displaced towards the red end of the spectrum, that means that the star is receding from us. If they are displaced towards the violet end, that means that the star is approaching us. The light waves are, in fact, in the one case crushed together, in the other drawn out. Recent work with this method at the Lowell Observatory has shown that the Great Andromeda Nebula is approaching us at the rate of 300 km per second, and other nebulae show still higher velocities. But they are so far off, hopelessly beyond the reach of parallax, almost too far for guesswork, that some astronomers incline to think them outside our universe altogether, an unacceptable guess in my humble judgment. The Great Nebula in Orion is, of course, the biggest. It covers a region of space not less than one which light would only cross in 40 years. But we cannot suggest a maximum limit of its magnitude, because we have no notion how far off it is. When we call it the nebula in Orion, we merely mean that we can see it if we look in the direction of Orion. How far it may be behind the stars of that group is wholly uncertain. How do we see it? Is it self-luminous? There is reason to assume that the matter of which it consists is rarer than the rarest vacuum we can create here by instrumental means. How can such attenuated matter emit light? That is one of the puzzles we have still to deal with in connection with this subject. But meanwhile it seems pretty clear that there are some nebulae that do not shine, dark nebulae that play some mysterious part in the vast economy of nature. The nebulous matter that almost surrounds the Pleiades is assumed to be dark in the sense of not being self-luminous, because its spectrum is identical with that of the stars to which it belongs, indicating that it shines with reflected light. Then the behavior of Nova Persei, the star which suddenly blazed out in the constellation Perseus in 1901, suggested the existence in that connection of a vast dark nebula. It lighted up a region of the sky, the magnitude of which forbade the idea that there had been any transmission of matter across that space. The phenomenon could only be due to the velocity of light. The paper before me makes favorable mention of the planetesimal theory that has been much discussed of late in scientific reviews. Bracketing it with the theory that nebulae that show planetesimal knots or nuclei have originated from the collision of worn-out suns. Possibly. There is reason to suppose that such collisions are among nature's methods in starting a new nebula. But it is just as easy to assign planetesimal knots to the aggregation of matter within the spirals of a nebula after it has been started in business by some other device, the condensation of etheric matter from infinite space, for example. One word more while on this subject concerning a theory that some astronomers have favored to the effect that nebules, in some cases at all events, may be so remote that they constitute universes outside our own altogether. Our universe, on that H3 hypothesis, is the whole stellar system embraced by the Milky Way, and shaped, in the aggregate, like a millstone, the diameter greatly exceeding its thickness. Nebulae are more frequent in the direction of the thickness than in that of the diameter, and from that condition of things the hypothesis referred to has arisen. It has always seemed to me to rest on quite insufficient data, and I am glad to see that an American astronomer, Professor Barnard, dismisses it with confidence in its mistaken character. We used to think, he says, of these nebulae as being at such vast distances from us, much beyond the limits of our universe of stars. Photography has shown in many ways that though their distances must be great indeed, they are often well this side of more distant stars, and that many of them, perhaps most of them, are within our stellar system, and are no farther away than some of the brighter stars. In connection with the services photography has rendered to astronomical science, Professor Barnard mentions one that is new to me, though doubtless familiar to experts in that line. Comets, but faintly perceptible by the telescope and showing no tails to the observer, are seen to have tails by the photographic plate. And such tails will sometimes be seen to drift away from the comet altogether, the plate following them for some days till they dissipate in space. That fits in beautifully with the theory that comets' tails consist of minute particles driven off by light pressure from the sun. Though we have to take into account evidence afforded by the plate that changes take place in the structure of comets' tails apparently due to forces emanating from the comet itself. 2. Within or beyond our universe. The American magazine Popular Astronomy is a very serious publication, claiming respectful attention, so I have been much interested in a statement I find in the last number, concerning the well-known and beautiful globular cluster in Hercules. This is one of the most wonderful objects in the heavens when seen through a fine telescope. It consists of thousands of suns aggregated together in dense mass, so that the light of all those situated towards the middle is blended in one mighty glow. Only those towards the periphery of the stupendous assemblage being discernible as separate points of light. Now it appears that one astronomer, Mr. Harlow Shapley, of the Mount Wilson Solar Observatory, has arrived at the conclusion, by what process of reasoning we are not told, that the cluster is distant from us to an extent that would make its parallax, if it had 0.0001. Its distance from us, therefore, would be 100,000 light-years, and its diameter 1,000 light-years. According to this calculation, says Popular Astronomy, the cluster is thus another sidereal universe external to our own. Of course, some astronomers have always been inclined to think that some of the nebulae are in this way other universes, a view I have always been disinclined to adopt. Mr. Pickering, I.C., who contributes to the magazine, just quoted an article on the 60 finest objects in the sky, merely mentions the cluster in Hercules as a very fine object, and does not discuss Mr. Shapley's calculation. But he treats the fact that most of the clusters lie within 5 to 30 degrees of the galactic equator as adverse to the theory that they are objects lying beyond the galaxy, although such may nevertheless be the case. Now the line of thought that seems to me more definitely adverse to the theory has to do with infinitudes of various unthinkable orders, taken in conjunction with ideas suggested by the visible facts of our own universe. By that last phrase I mean all the millions of visible stars embraced by the Milky Way. The actual diameter of the space included by that wonderful girdle is a matter of conjecture, but roughly the Milky Way is often spoken of as probably about 50,000 light-years away from us in either direction. Assuming that we are somewhere near the center of the whole system, there or thereabouts. Now planetary distribution within the solar system shows us outer planets set at ever-increasing distances from the central sun. We have not yet worked out any map showing the distribution of solar systems in the universe, but the old Hermetic philosophers had a favorite saying, as below, so above. It is applicable to many observed facts of nature, and if we start with the assumption that in the infinities of space there may or must be other universes, the probability would be that they are dispersed in space on principles resembling the dispersal of planets within the solar system. The nearest planet to the Sun is many times as distant as the Sun's diameter. The nearest external universe to us ought on the same principle to be many times the distance of our universe's diameter, and that, as I have said above, is guessed at about 100,000 light-years. So the nearest external universe ought to be much more than that distance away. It sounds ridiculous to talk of 100,000 light-years as an incredible measurement by reason of being too little, but in talking about universes we must think in terms of infinitude. All this, I grant, is in the region of the most unpractical thinking in which we can indulge, but that is one of the fascinating attributes of astronomy, it takes us outside the area of low-down practicalities. 3. Planets, stars and atoms. Like other sciences, astronomy was paralyzed by the war, and very little new work was accomplished during its progress. But some observations were directed to the question whether the satellites of Jupiter revolve on their axes or keep only one face to their august primary. To be more rigidly accurate, do they rotate on their axes only once in the period of a revolution round the primary, or more often? The question is full of interest, because it is always cropping up in reference to the interior planets, Venus and Mercury, and has a very important bearing on all speculation as to life in other worlds. The one celestial body that undoubtedly turns only one face to its primary is our own moon. But by common consent the moon is to be regarded as a dead planet, whether we accept, what seems to me, the foolish theory that it is a fragment of the Earth torn off at an early stage of our planetary life. Or the other theory that it is really the remains of an older world than ours, the outer casings of which were melted off when the nebular condensation that gave rise to our world was in progress. Now we cannot frame any corresponding hypothesis that would account for the satellites of Jupiter. Let me remind the reader of what we know about them. Leaving out of account the later discovered exterior satellites outside the familiar four, and these may be merely masses of meteoric matter caught by the attraction of Jupiter, the well-known four are bodies of considerable magnitude. The two innermost, Io and Europa, to give them the names that have been assigned to them, are somewhat smaller than our moon. The two outer ones, Ganymede and Callisto, are somewhat larger. These have been the subject of study by Mr. Waterfield of the British Astronomical Association, and he thinks he has discerned markings which show that Callisto always turns the same face to Jupiter, while Ganymede, the outermost of the four, does not seem quite to do this, but has a period of rotation 59 minutes less than the period of its revolution round the primary. It seems presumptuous to criticize the conclusions of an astronomer using powerful instruments. But this theory about tidal action, the assumed cause of the single rotation idea, is so much in fashion just now that one can well believe observers falling in with it, prone to discover evidence in its favor. My main objection to it turns on very broad principles which seem to underlie all reasonable theories of the universe. So far as observation enables us to check the conception, the purpose of manifestation on the physical plane is to provide for the activities of life. All intelligent thinkers have long since got beyond the primitive notion that the Earth is the only inhabited world, that the sun and stars exist merely for our sake. We need not jump to the conception that all other worlds are inhabited by beings just like ourselves, but the more closely we study the Earth the more we find it teeming with life of one kind or another in every corner. Life in forms adapted to the most varied conditions of heat and cold. Directly faith lifts us above blank materialism, it becomes impossible to rest content with the idea that any of the other planets of the solar system are mere purposeless masses of dead matter. They must be theaters of life of one kind or another. Now the theory about turning one face to the primary has even been applied to the interior planets of our system. Venus and Mercury are supposed by some astronomers to turn only one face to the Sun. But this arrangement would make them unfit to be the theaters of life of any kind. One part would be burnt to a cinder, and the other frozen to an unimaginable degree. The theory as applied to Venus and Mercury is an insult to the harmonies of nature, and if observers think they have detected markings the motions of which seem to imply the single rotation arrangement, I do not say tant pis pour les faits, but tant pis pour the current interpretation of the facts. As regards the satellites of Jupiter, it is true, even though they should really turn one face to the primary, they would in their revolution round him turn all faces in succession to the Sun. So such light and warmth as they get from him would be evenly diffused. On the other hand, as against Mr. Waterfield's contention, we have to take first the all but universality of the habit celestial bodies have of turning on their axes. Secondly, the Jupiter satellites, whatever their origin may have been, are certainly not what our satellite is, remains of a world older than the primary. They are four independent bodies of considerable magnitude, and we must await the development of our knowledge to a far higher level than we have yet reached before expecting to comprehend their beginnings. We are ancients of the earth, etc. And the expansion of our faculties since the days of King Alfred have bridged the spaces of this world in a way that would have indeed seemed unthinkable for the earlier ancients of that time. Another advance of corresponding importance may enable us, or our successors, to cross in consciousness the spaces of the solar system. In another direction of astronomical research, some American attention has been turned to star clusters, with results rather too speculative to command unqualified trust. Working with calculations based upon apparent magnitudes and probable real luminosities, one observer of the great cluster in Hercules assigns to it a parallax that would give the distance across the cluster as 1,100 light-years. The calculation is used to fortify the conjecture that such clusters are distant universes lying in space apart from our universe, bounded by the Milky Way. Except as giving us enormous magnitudes to think about, speculation of this order hardly seems interesting. Metascience. We recognize metaphysics as a formless realm in which the mind may wander and be free of the tiresome regulations that impede thinking when we are concerned with science. But as the intelligence of the world expands, may there come into recognition, by degrees, a variety of thinking that shall be called metascience, based on a gradual comprehension of natural law extending beyond the realm of matter. An article on Fatalism and Destiny, in the Times Literary Supplement, just published as I begin to write, suggests this question. The author of the article reaches no definite conclusions, and is mainly concerned with putting aside, in an attitude of lordly superiority, what he assumes to be a tendency among soldiers engaged in the war to adopt the theory of fatalism. Such theories are strange, because they seem like the intrusion of a forgotten human nature into the rational body of our beliefs. The soldier in the midst of exploding shells is graciously pardoned for taking refuge in fatalism, and the author wanders, for 3 columns, around the subject, somehow finding comfort in a distinction between fatalism and destiny, the value of which may not be very clear to the reader. Now it is quite true that the war has made the whole subject, and many others that cling to it, much more insistent in their demand on attention than they used to be in the ancient days of peace. And the wave of interest in superphysical research and speculation that is spreading through the intellectual world has a force that seems likely ere long to bear down the affectation that the newspapers, as a rule, still maintain, the pretense of assuming that all attempts to penetrate the unseen mysteries of nature represent the foolishness of weak minds to be laughed out of court by the sane man in the street. People who have lost dear relations in the war are not easily warned off inquiries that may throw light on their fate. And when they make inquiry they find that belief in the possibility of getting definite news from those who have passed on is not confined, as they had been told, to weak-minded women and fraudulent fortune-tellers, but is held as a solid conviction by a large number of the most eminent men of the time. Then they are duly impressed. Such books as Sir A. Conan Doyle's New Revelation, Sir William Barrett's Threshold of the Unseen, and Sir Oliver Lodge's Raymond, and scores of earlier volumes of equal value and dignified authorship, make the old-fashioned attitude of supercilious contempt for spiritualism too ridiculous to be kept up much longer even in Fleet Street. So we may be approaching a time when metaphysics of the old-fashioned order, vague speculation about the nature of thought, and the intangible philosophies of Hegel or Schopenhauer, will make way for the development of a metascience based on as definite a foundation of fact and acquired knowledge as the sciences concerned with the laws governing matter. As for the fatalism of the gallant soldier taking his chances with the shells, if that fortifies his natural pluck we may well be content to let it alone. And perhaps metascience will show the looker-on that even if the hostile shell bears no definite address, the long run makes it a matter of little ultimate consequence whom it hits. Metascience seems to indicate, even in its present stage of development, that no life is found, which only to one engine bound, falls off but cycles always round. Tennyson did not stop, when he wrote The Two Voices, to work out all the consequences of this hypothesis, but amongst others it suggests that even if no fatalism guarantees the justice of each individual death on the battlefield, compensation in the long run is mathematically certain. And that view has the incidental recommendation of making the free will of humanity the ultimately dominant force in our progress through the ages. The most troublesome impediment in the way of metascience progress arises from the irritation many otherwise intelligent people feel when asked to pay attention to some alleged occurrence that does not fit in with previous knowledge. When new phenomena, like the penetrating power of Röntgen rays or the susceptibility of electric waves in the ether to be detected by suitable instruments, can be reproduced at pleasure, the irritation soon disappears, and the new discovery passes into the region of common knowledge. But sometimes a new discovery, though genuine, may for a time be elusive. Consider for a moment the phenomena of mesmerism, now passing into use in medical practice, though very imperfectly understood. The will of the mesmerist can be proved as often as you like to have a definite effect on the patient, but by reason of not knowing how it operates, irritation prevents the man in the street from believing the fact, though he might just as well disbelieve in the aurora borealis. But in truth few subjects on which we can speculate are more attractive to the meta-scientist than the rationale of the human will. People generally do not stop to consider that it is really the original cause of almost everything that is accomplished in physical life. No house has ever been built, no machine has ever been constructed, unless to begin with some human will had started the activities required to materialize the idea. But when it merely controls the bricklayer, through the intermediation of wages, and materializes itself by slow degrees, people lose sight of the fact that will has been the origin of the result. Future science has got to ascertain whether there may not be some more direct way of bringing will to bear on matter. Atoms and ether. I have referred from time to time to the theory that the electron is an atom of electricity supported, in the beginning at all events, by Sir J. J. Thomson and Sir Oliver Lodge. I have ventured to repudiate that theory in favor of its rival, the theory that the electron is an atom of ether carrying a definite charge of electricity. Of course, I am very far from being alone in dissenting from the views of the dignified authorities just mentioned, but the atomic theory of electricity must be regarded so far as the more orthodox view of the two. And a recent number of Nature actually heads an article with the words, "The atom of electricity." Now, of course, one difficulty in the way of general acceptance for the etheric theory of the electron arises from the view that has been widely entertained concerning the constitution of the ether itself. According to that conception, the attributes of the ether embody a mass of paradox. It has been described as non-molecular, denser than the densest metals and yet utterly intangible to our senses, perfectly frictionless, interpenetrating all matter, which is at the same time passing through it with planetary velocity. Then this mysterious medium, at once denser than the densest solid, and less so than the finest gases, is undulating all the time at rates which paralyze imagination, and giving rise to all the sensations of light and color. But are we incapable of framing any theory that will fit the facts better than the ultradense non-molecular theory? The great Russian chemist, Mendeleev, answered that question some years ago in a book that attracted at the time less attention than it deserved, while now, in the midst of the electron controversy, it really clamors for attention. It is called A Chemical Conception of the Ether. I will endeavor to explain the argument, content to say, first, that there can be no one in the scientific hierarchy great enough to treat any views of Mendeleev's with disdain. He was the originator of the universally accepted periodic table of the elements, an arrangement which groups them in octaves in a way somewhat resembling the grouping of musical sounds. The elements in each recurring octave show attributes corresponding to those of the previous octave. The discovery of this relationship has given rise to many other discoveries, for there were gaps in the periodic table as first drawn up on the basis of such knowledge as was then at our disposal. These gaps pointed to the probability that there ought to be elements that would fit them, and with that clue, one by one most of these have been discovered. Within recent years, however, the discovery of the inert gases of the atmosphere, argon, helium, krypton and the rest, presented chemists with a new puzzle. There was no place for them in the periodic table. Mendeleev, in the book I have named above, finds the difficulty merely the introduction to a new and brilliant hypothesis. All these inert gases form a new group or column by themselves, and their atomic weights fit in with this arrangement. But there are gaps in the new column I. To make the arrangement symmetrical there should be two bodies lighter than helium. And this condition of things harmonizes with a belief Mendeleev tells us he has long entertained that there ought to be two elements, as yet unknown to science, lighter than hydrogen. He boldly fills up these two gaps with bodies X and Y, and X, the lighter of the two, he suggests, is the ether. This presentation of the idea by such an illustrious representative of orthodox chemistry as Mendeleev will be of fascinating interest to a group of thinkers on subjects of this kind, towards whom, though they may seem as yet in the vanguard of wild speculation, my sympathies are inclined to lean. According to that view the ether is the ultimate form of physical matter, from which all the familiar varieties of matter are derived. This view establishes the ether really as the protyle of Crookes' famous hypothesis as to the genesis of the elements. It seems to me that with Mendeleev's help we are bringing a lot of previously scattered conceptions to a common focus. Arguing from the analogies of the other columns, Mendeleev assigns to X or the ether an atomic weight, a maximum value, of 0 to 17. Probably, he says, the weight is far less, as analogy suggests that its molecule contains only one atom. To interpret the argument would involve the use of mathematical formulae that would be out of place here, but it helps to explain the fact that the ether pervades all space, disregarding the attraction of planets. The velocity of its atomic vibrations would enable it to overcome gravitation. And the dimensions of the etheric atoms would be of such a minute order that they obviously may provide a material basis for the unit charge of electricity described as the electron. While this view of the whole subject gets rid of what has always seemed to me the monstrous absurdity of treating force as atomic. One might as well talk of an atom of gravitation. Atoms and misunderstandings. Science has so long been commandeered for the service of the war, that in reference to some of its pre-war achievements it has failed to make further progress. Especially is this the case in connection with the study of the electron, so that a view I have long held be a delusion, and have often ventured to describe as such, still commands general acquiescence. I rejoice, therefore, to observe in America the dawn of a clear understanding as to the real place in nature of that elusive particle. Sir J. J. Thomson and others still persist in regarding it as an atom of electricity. A long and, as it seems to me, an extremely intelligent article appears in the Scientific American, under the heading, The Relations of Matter and Ether. That all atoms of physical matter, even the finest, those of hydrogen, are built up each of many electrons, is a practically established fact, though opinions still differ widely as to the number of electrons in each. Anyhow, these are supposed, quite correctly in all probability, to move about freely within the space included by the atom, just as the planets of a solar system move about within the space embraced by each solar system. The article before me recognizes the electron as thus the unit of physical matter, while agreeing that it is also, or represents also, the unit volume of electric force. It has a dual aspect. I must here quote a few lines from the article to show how the writer glides into the view I have always maintained. A question of moment here arises. Can the corpuscles of the ether, its unit particle, be smaller than this vastly minute particle of matter? Are we not warranted in suggesting that these may be in the same category so far as size is concerned? Yet if this is admitted as probable we cannot stop here. If these excessively minute particles, the electron and the ether corpuscles, are similar in size, may they not be similar in other directions? In short, may they not be identical? On the basis of this more than reasonable hypothesis, the writer goes on to draw various inferences. We start with the conception of the ether as atomic in its constitution and filling all space, the raw material from which all physical matter is built up. May it not be susceptible of existence in different states as physical matter exists in the three states, solid, liquid, and gaseous? Then the atomic condition in which it fills all space and transmits the vibrations of light and heat would be its gaseous condition. In its liquid condition it might roll up into drops analogous to those of water, and become atoms of physical matter. I do not find that idea at all helpful. A much simpler and more natural view treats the aggregation of etheric atoms into physical molecules as a process accomplished by stages. Atomic ether does not appeal to our physical senses. Evidently there must be some minimum number of etheric atoms in a molecule to render it so qualified. Aggregations of lesser number would still remain imperceptible to our senses. But it would be extravagant to assume that nature has no activities outside those limits. The minor aggregations of etheric atoms that do not come within the range of our senses must constitute so many varieties of molecular ether. I have long been convinced that there are such varieties of molecular ether, and when this comes to be recognized it will open the door to a flood of new speculation concerning the phenomena of light, heat and color. More than this, it will put a new and greatly more nature-like complexion on theories concerning the radiations from the sun. We are all familiar with the calculation showing that the heat radiations of the sun are wasted to the extent of some ridiculous percentage, because so little of them can actually impinge upon the planets. Suppose no heat is really wasted. That what we call heat is an effect developed by the molecular ether surrounding each planet, that the vibrations of the atomic ether of interstellar space are not heat at all. I am not daring to assert this. Future discovery may follow some quite different line, but the discovery of molecular ether, at present merely a profoundly plausible hypothesis, arising from the discovery of the electron, seems to me sure of accomplishment now science is getting out of khaki after the war. Certainly we shall have to improve our present senses, or get some more, before we can expect to be directly cognizant of molecular ether, but we already deal with many natural phenomena beyond the range of the senses. Invisible light and inaudible sound are favorite subjects for scientific lectures. The ultraviolet rays can be detected by the photographic plate, the note of a whistle, too shrill to be heard, can be observed by the sensitive flame. Over and above the debt that optics in the future may owe to the discovery of molecular ether, it may go a long way towards breaking down the habit of 19th-century science, which used to make it so scornful of everything it could neither see, hear, nor feel. For many men of science, and for multitudes whose beliefs are based on personal experience, the new senses required to enable us to penetrate the mysteries of nature farther than this has been done by merely physical researches, are recognized as beginning to flicker about here and there, and are loosely grouped under the title clairvoyance. They are already available for scientific purposes. I hesitate no longer to include the subject in the range of scientific developments, partly because, as Sir Oliver Lodge has put it, those who disbelieve in the existence of clairvoyance do not express an opinion, but merely show ignorance. And partly because my own experience has very fully confirmed that view. Vaguely most people imagine that clairvoyance has to do with fortune-telling and ghost stories. In reality it is sometimes directed to genuine scientific research, and, for example, to the study of the atom. Along this line of inquiry it has been ascertained, if we treat the method as reliable, that the number of etheric atoms, or electrons, in an atom, or molecule, of hydrogen is 18. Current scientific guesses on the subject vary so widely that some writers put the figure down as 2 or 3, or even 1, while others soar in imagination to the level of many thousands. The theory is supported along the line of research that gave rise to it, by the observation of other atoms besides those of hydrogen. Many have been examined, and the result shows that in all such cases the larger numbers identified with heavier atoms, when divided by 18, give the recognized atomic weights of the substances in question. The discovery is full of deep significance. It shows the etheric atom, minute as it is, to be actually ponderable, and obviously supports the key number 18. I freely grant that as yet the new senses required for scientific clairvoyance are so rarely found in adequate perfection, that they cannot be checked by use in different laboratories. But if a gradual prima facie belief in their occasional existence gains ground, efforts will assuredly be made to cultivate the faculty where it exists in embryo. And by degrees true scientific research will certainly be pushed beyond that threshold of the unseen that Sir William Barrett writes about with remarkable effect. Archaeology, relics of antiquity. From Central America, south of Mexico, as the county narrows towards the Isthmus of Panama, the peninsula of Yucatan stretches out eastward. It is not a region that tempts civilized immigrants. The climate is not specially unhealthy, but too hot to be pleasant. Its 500,000 or so of primitive inhabitants have no mineral wealth. Nature endows them with mahogany trees and tolerates tobacco, cotton, and the sugar cane. But the only product which Yucatan sells to the outer world is henequen, a kind of hemp used in the manufacture of coarse sackcloth and hammocks. Yet from one point of view, that of the archaeologist, Yucatan is one of the most interesting regions in the world. It links us with a past that lies far behind the few thousand years that engaged the attention of the Egyptologist, and puts us in touch with a period of the Earth's history which used to be regarded as entirely mythical, but has emerged from that comfortless moral atmosphere and is now accorded a grudging recognition by orthodox geology. The fundamental fact that the Atlantic basin must once have been, for the most part, continental land, would no longer offend any modern geologist. The idea used to be ridiculed, but is now treated as a matter of course. Plato, however, is so far only partially vindicated. Geology tolerates the theory that there must once have been an Atlantean land, but declines to have anything to do with the theory that it was inhabited. This is the stage in the development of prehistoric knowledge at which Yucatan comes in. And I am tempted to deal with the subject because one number of the Scientific American has an article about the antiquities of Yucatan that may help to get attention focused on their enormous significance. Yucatan, says the writer, can well be called the American Egypt. The ruins of 172 cities, big and little, have been discovered, and not a quarter of the territory has been explored. Tropical vegetation makes the work difficult. You might pass within 100 feet of a wonderful old temple or pyramid 100 times, and not discover it, so effectively does the jungle screen these crumbling monuments of the distant past. The article goes on to tell us that some of these ruins must once have been large cities, with not less than 500,000 inhabitants in each one. The writer, who seems to have had personal experience, has found one pyramid the most interesting among all these relics of the past. The steps on one side are fairly well preserved, and at the top is a platform, which was the sacrificial altar. There the priests cut out the hearts of living victims. In a great quadrangle at the foot of the pyramid the inhabitants of the city used to gather to watch these festal doings. Around were the palaces of nuns, for whose special delectation these sacrifices were made. The nuns were the aristocrats of ancient Maya society. The writer does not tell us from what authorities he derives his information, but anyone who wants to study the subject further will find all he needs in the books of Dr. Le Plongeon, an American archaeologist, though with a French name, who devoted his life to the study of Mexican, and especially Yucatan, antiquities, and did much more than merely describe remains. These, like the antiquities of Egypt, are covered to a large extent with inscriptions in hieroglyphic character. The hieroglyphics seem the same as those used in Egypt, but the Egyptologists could make nothing of them. Egyptian hieroglyphics became intelligible when the Rosetta Stone showed what language they spelled. But they certainly did not spell Coptic in Yucatan. The discovery of the language they did spell is the splendid gift Le Plongeon bestowed on the archaeological world, and because the results offended the prejudices of the period, still clinging to the idea that Atlantis was a fable. They were never properly appreciated. But the scientific mind at the present day is more accessible to new views, which sometimes involve the restoration of very old views. And the stone inscriptions of Yucatan are already establishing some broad conclusions respecting the people of the old Atlantic continent, compared to whom the earliest Egyptian and Chaldean civilizations were recent stages of human history. In several places Le Plongeon came upon inscriptions plainly describing the final catastrophe that submerged the last great surviving fragment of the old Atlantean continent. The date of the catastrophe is even given with precision. It took place 8,060 years before the period at which the event was recorded. Plausible guesses as to the date of the inscriptions add about 3,500 years to the 8,000-odd, so it was about 9,000-odd BC when the stupendous cataclysm took place. And that only affected the last then remaining fragment of the original continent. Yucatan again helps us to realize in some measure what it must have been in its entirety. I was once intimate with a friend, who has since passed away, who was engaged in important mining operations in Mexico. He told me that in the course of explorations in that country and Yucatan, bits of an old road had been discovered in the midst of what seemed primeval jungle. These made a dotted line on the map which extended down through Yucatan, ending abruptly at the sea coast. But again, farther on, bits were discovered on islands lying out at sea. Evidently the old road connected the cities of Mexico and Yucatan with other important centers in regions now covered by the Atlantic Ocean. Inscriptions deciphered by Le Plongeon relate to events happening in that region. One of his books deals with the history of a certain Queen Mu of the faraway past, who was driven from her dominions by usurping brothers, and migrated by a long overland journey to Egypt, where among other doings she introduced the Sphinx as an emblem that had previously been what we should call the crest of her family. When the world is at leisure again to concern itself with matters of mere intellectual interest, we may profit by renewed researches in Yucatan to the extent of framing a much more complete history of the Atlantean period. But we shall have to get into the habit of thinking in millions, instead of thousands, of years before we can map out in our minds the stupendous periods through which human evolution has passed. Americans do things thoroughly sometimes. And if they begin to realize that, while the youngest of the great nations in one way, they are also geographically the oldest, they may find it worthwhile to devote national efforts to the further development of the work which one of their own countrymen, Le Plongeon, has begun so well. They are apparently waking up to the interests of archaeology if their leading scientific paper, The Scientific American, can be regarded as showing the direction of the wind. Besides its Yucatan article, recent numbers deal at length with the antiquities of Ceylon, though these relate to the yesterdays of the world compared with the remains of cities and pyramids hidden in the jungles of Yucatan. Cataclysms and earthquakes. Everything, says a familiar proverb, comes to those who wait, even the vindication, at the hands of exoteric science, of information acquired from the great teachers of occultism, however widely this may seem. At first sight, at variance with conventional views. Within the last few years, something fresh has come out about earthquakes which has an important bearing on the physical history of this world, as interpreted by esoteric teaching and investigation. Almost everything that stands written in encyclopedias and popular textbooks concerning earthquakes is now out of date. And under the highest scientific auspices we are introduced to a view of this subject that begins to be in harmony with nature's records in reference to the great geographical catastrophes that from time to time have altered the face of the globe. The modern world is indebted to Japan for having done most up to the present time in the direction of elucidating the mystery of earthquakes. Certainly Japan has been better qualified than any other country to take a leading part in this investigation. It is favored, if that phrase be admissible, with opportunities for studying earthquakes which no other country enjoys. On an average Japan endures 3 a day, not always on the scale of that which, in 1891, destroyed 10,000 lives, and involved the government in an expenditure of $30 million on repairs, but at all events of one kind or another. Perhaps for scientific purposes the little earthquakes are most useful. When towns are shivering in ruins, and railway viaducts being tied up into knots, the most zealous seismologist may get confused in his observations. But anyhow, taking all sorts together, Japan has plenty of seismological material to work with. The examination of this has become an intellectual fashion in Japan, and a seismograph is as common an article of luxury in a Japanese household as a mantelpiece clock with us. The government has liberally subsidized the investigation, and a distinguished English engineer for some time past occupied what may be called the chair of earthquakes at the Tokyo University. Professor Milne, the engineer in question, has thus become the leading authority on earthquakes, and as such he lectured at the Royal Institution one Friday evening, a few years ago. In the hour he had at his disposal he did not survey the various hypotheses that have been put forward from time to time to account for earthquakes, but it may be worth while to glance at these here, for the benefit of readers unfamiliar with the subject. The volcanic theory has perhaps been most in favor. Earthquakes, it has been assumed, have been underground disturbances that have not been near enough to the surface to break out as eruptions, but have nevertheless shaken and dislocated the upper strata. Another notion has been that they were due to the influx of seawater into internal cavities in the crust of the earth. Steam, at a high temperature, it was supposed, would be engendered in this way, and an earthquake would ensue on the principle of an explosion in a steam boiler. Yet another theory suggested the reaction of certain chemical ingredients coming into contact in the interior cavities of the Earth's crusts. Gases at a high pressure were thus supposed to be developed, and hence the explosive energy displayed. All these conjectures are equally dispelled by the results of the Japanese investigations. Professor Milne did not think it worth while even to notice the steam and chemical theories, but he paid the volcanic theory the compliment of a specific repudiation. We have arrived at the conclusion, he declared, that earthquakes have nothing whatever to do with volcanoes. They are not local phenomena at all, not due to causes engendered in the neighborhood where they occur, but to great waves or pulsations to which the crust of the earth is constantly subject. The effect of which is not perceived unless some rupture ensues. The huge, slow waves or undulations are described in the new terminology of earthquake science as bradyseismic disturbances, and they are going on just as freely and steadily in quiet regions. Where earthquakes in the ordinary sense of the word are unknown, as in regions like Japan, or the west coast of South America, where they are frequent. But now and then it happens that as the bradyseismic wave encounters some irregular resistance or weakness in the strata it disturbs, something gives way, something cracks, and then a shiver goes through the region where that occurs. Such a shiver may in a few moments destroy property worth millions, and lives by the thousand. Another influence productive of earthquake disturbance is described by Professor Milne as a secular crush and flow. Observation has shown how wonderfully responsive the solid earth is to changes of weight pressing upon it. The deposition and evaporation of dew in the evening produces a sensible movement of the ground, sensible, that is to say, to the new and delicately adjusted seismographs in use for such observations. What, then, must be the effect of the regular denudation of continents that is always going on, and of the deposition of the mud carried down by rivers on the bottom of the sea? The latest conjecture is that this pressure is sufficient to cause an actual flow of solid rock away from the regions of greatest pressure. We know, of course, that solid and viscous are merely relative expressions. Treacle is only more viscous than lead, which in the ordinary course of bullet making is now squeezed, cold, out of holes by hydraulic pressure, and flows like so much putty. Lead is only more viscous than steel. Ice, it is now suggested, is only more viscous than granite. Every solid substance is viscous in one degree or another. Imagine a thick, evenly spread bed of soft clay, then imagine a weight put down on any part of the surface. One sees at once that the weight would sink into the clay, more or less, and that part of the clay beneath would be squeezed out laterally, heaving up the surface elsewhere. That is just what takes place in connection with the secular flow of the earth's lower strata, and here we get into relations with a second great cause of earthquakes, the effect of which, in causing a rupture of the superior strata somewhere, is similar, apparently, to the effect of the bradyseismic wave. As a matter of fact, earthquakes are most numerous in those parts of the world where the seashore falls very abruptly into deep ocean. That occurs to the eastward of Japan, and also on the western side of South America. But one of the most interesting facts now brought to light is that wherever an earthquake takes place the shock of it is really felt all over the rest of the world. The vibration passes, apparently, through the solid body of the earth. We must leave off talking about the crust of the earth. That phrase is derived from an early hypothesis that has been discredited for a long while, that has been at variance with all the physical teaching permeating theosophical information, and is now clearly untenable in the light of the new seismology. The whole body of the earth is plainly capable of transmitting vibrations of the kind that are transmitted by matter of the utmost rigidity. There is evidence to show that the earthquake waves are communicated from one part of the world to another with definite velocities, and they do not make their way round the globe. They pass through T by the most direct line that can be drawn from one point to another. The rate at which the vibrations are transmitted is extraordinarily high, in some instances approaching a speed of 12 km per second, or double the rate at which a wave of compression could pass through steel or glass. Further than this, if this direct line passes only through a shallow segment of the earth, the rate of transmission is less rapid than if it passes through a greater mass. That is to say, the most rapid transmission would be straight through, from any given point to its antipodal point. I say, would be, because up to the present time seismological observations have not been carried out extensively enough to have provided for antipodal stations corresponding to the regions of most frequent disturbance. But the character of all observations that have been made at places widely separated indicates an increasing velocity in direct ratio with the depth through the earth followed by the course of transmission. The trustworthiness of the inferences already arrived at as regards the rate at which the vibrations travel, is shown by the fact that already it is possible to tell, from observations in England, at what moment an earthquake has taken place in Japan. At Professor Milne's Seismological Observatory in the Isle of Wight, he has been enabled on some occasions to anticipate the announcements of the telegraph in reference to earthquakes in Japan. Once he announced, before any telegraphic news had been received, that such an event had taken place on a certain date, at such and such an hour and minute. When the news came in the ordinary course of things, it turned out that he had been right within an error of 1 minute only. In another case, when the papers announced that a great earthquake had taken place at Kobe, his instruments had given no indications to correspond. He declared the news to be inaccurate, and in due time it turned out to have been without foundation. The importance of all this as bearing on questions in which theosophical students are interested, has to do with the light it throws on the old standing question of cataclysms. The drift of conventional scientific thinking for some time past has been in the direction of what geologists call uniformity. We do not see cataclysms going on around us at present. But we do see the gradual operation of forces that over very long periods of time may be supposed capable of superinducing the changes of land and water distribution that must assuredly take place. Rain and the rivers are continually washing down the soil of continents to the sea. In this way ocean beds are being filled up, and existing land surfaces denuded. Shores in some places are being eaten away by the sea, and in other places slowly raised, so that former beaches are now hoisted halfway up high cliffs. In time, it is supposed by the uniformitarians, these gradual processes would suffice to account for the largest changes we like to imagine. They would not account, however, for the violent convulsions of which theosophical teachers speak as having happened in the past and of which, indeed, advancing theosophical students, beginning to be able to apply their own powers of observation to remote historical investigation, are enabled to speak with much detail. Those of us who comprehend the trustworthiness of investigation of that sort may have no doubt about the fact, whether modern science yet recognizes it or not. But it is always gratifying to derive from modern science confirmation of theosophic teaching. And while the local theory of earthquakes held the field, no such confirmation was forthcoming in reference to such events in the past as the destruction of Atlantis. Now we begin to perceive along what road the ultimate developments of physical knowledge will converge towards the conclusions of occult investigation. The bradyseismical waves of the new seismology fit in perfectly with a belief that, at long intervals of time, natural convulsions may occur on a very much larger scale than that of any which have been recorded within historic periods. Some of these, of course, have been fairly big. The Lisbon catastrophe not only killed 60,000 people at the seat of its chief activity, but distributed its influence perceptibly over an area, according to Humboldt's calculation, 4 times as great as Europe. As we know now, its influence must really have been felt all over the world, though in distant places too slightly to be measured by instruments then in use. The Calabria earthquake of 1783 destroyed 40,000 lives. But, after all, disasters of this magnitude are not commensurable with the least of the great Atlantean catastrophes. According to the Troano manuscript, translated by Dr. Le Plongeon, 60 million people perished in the final Posidones convulsion, which changed an inhabited territory, measuring over 2,000 miles one way by about 1,200 the other, into so much ocean bed. For people to whom the 6,000 or 7,000 years of the historic period seem to afford a good basis for generalization, it naturally appears unlikely that if our Lisbon earthquake is the champion convulsion for that period, anything so out of proportion with it should have taken place 6,000 or 7,000 years earlier. The bradyseismic wave system, taken in non-junction with the secular flow of rocks, puts a new complexion on all such speculation. Everything we know about vibrations tends to show that in nature these movements are superimposed one upon another. In electrical phenomena this is certainly the case, and in fact the whole principle of multiplex telegraphy is built upon that idea. Occult investigation into the nature of the ultimate atom points to the same kind of complexity there. In the motion of the planetary bodies we have to recognize similar movements within movements. The diurnal rotation of the Earth is superimposed upon the much slower precessional, or second rotation. Whatever the great pulsations of the Earth's surface may be due to, it is more than imaginable that a larger and slower pulsation passes through it at longer intervals. Earthquakes of the secondary order, like those which afflicted Lisbon in the last century, are due apparently to a rupture of some rock body giving way to the pressure of one of the relatively minor undulations of the strata below. A pulsation of greater magnitude may easily be supposed to create a superficial disturbance on a different scale altogether, one for which, perhaps, a long-continued operation of the secular rock flow has prepared the way. In addressing theosophical readers, a word or two seems desirable here on the question whether such catastrophes as those of the Atlantean age should be attributed to causes of uniform regularity, or to the intervention of the highest authorities connected with the government of the world, at crises when the depravity of mankind renders the extinction of life on a large scale a necessity of the situation. The destruction of Atlantis has generally been talked of with reference to some such intervention. But everything we learn about the evolution of the race to which we belong points to the synchronism between the regular progress of natural law and the development of crises in human destiny. The recognition of this synchronism will not interfere with our simultaneous recognition of free will as regards the individual. No one is bound to give way to the temptations of his race or period in evolution, but taking the stupendous numbers concerned into account, it is certain that so many, within a limit of error, will follow the stream, while so many will strike out a path for themselves. In Atlantean ages the course of the stream was in a direction which, at all events for us, would be the direction of evil. Sooner or later it was inevitable that a condition of things should be developed which would require a violent remedy. One need hardly be surprised to find that the remedy under those circumstances was provided for by a geological crisis, towards which the Earth's strata had been moving all the while that the Atlantean majority were working out the moral necessity of their own destruction. Poetry and Theosophy. A recent article in the Theosophist deals with a subject that has often engaged my thoughts. Much poetry is deplorably unspiritual by reason of treating death as a dismal finality, instead of being the gateway to new life, mors janua vitae. As Mr. Cousins puts it, revolution in Western literary arts would be brought about if the idea, say of reincarnation, could be given as full a place in thought as the current idea of a single life. I quite agree, but meanwhile a grand result would be achieved if poetry could help the world to realize that before attaining reincarnation, there is a period of happiness in the more immediate future awaiting all decent people on the astral plane. In our earlier teaching this was a good deal slurred over, as still wider aspects of truth claimed interpretation first. But in a recent book, In the Next World, I have endeavored to show how vivid, delightful, and fairly protracted may be that astral experience preceding not merely the return to physical life, but preceding any experiences on higher planes that may await any given ego. Therefore, the first great poetical reform I should like to see would be one that should encourage thought to range beyond the grave, instead of burrowing incessantly in that unimportant region. Consider, for instance, one of the most beautiful passages in all poetry, Moore's Farewell to Araby's Daughter, at the end of the Fire Worshippers. Its beauty resides entirely in the form, not in the substance. It is altogether a lament. Its exquisite language is concerned entirely with the dear girl's body lying at the bottom of the sea. The Paris who speak the dirge are solely engaged with their efforts to beautify its bed. Farewell, be it ours to embellish thy pillow with everything beauteous that grows in the deep. Each flower of the rock and each gem of the billow shall sweeten thy bed and illumine thy sleep. Around thee shall glisten the loveliest amber that ever the sorrowing seabird has wept, with many a shell in whose hollow-wreathed chamber we, Paris of ocean, by moonlight have slept. We'll dive where the gardens of coral lie darkling, and plant all the rosiest stems at thy head. We'll seek where the sands of the Caspian are sparkling, and gather their gold to strew over thy bed. For pure mellifluous beauty of expression those verses will rank with anything in literature, but what a ghastly blunder it was for Moore to spend his genius on thoughts about the dead girl's body. Instead of thinking about the girl I have endeavored to suggest a paraphrase of his superb effusion, what he might have given us instead if he had come within the range of theosophical teaching. To guard against misunderstanding, let me explain that I am not supposing that any rhymes of mine can rival Moore's in form. Moore, imperfectly appreciated in these days, was, among all poets that have ever lived, the supreme master of versification. Tennyson, a far grander poet as regards thought, has here and there touched Moore's perfection of form, but, as a composer of music in words, Moore is facile princeps. My effort is a concrete expression of wonder as to what might have been the character of his farewell had he known what, I think, I know about life immediately after death. Here are the verses. They are not a farewell, but a greeting. Welcome, thrice welcome, O Araby's daughter. A glad voice thus greeted her advent above. The form cast away into Oman's green water is needed no more in this bright realm of love. 'Twas fair for a while, giving transient expression for earth's passing use to a soul pure and white. But that is now rescued from fleshly possession, arrayed in a far fairer vesture of light. That agonized plunge in the dark dreary ocean was no coward flight from pain, peril, or strife. A gift to your lover, an act of devotion. A sacrifice laid on the altar of life. The world left behind you will weep o'er your story. Will fancy that you lie asleep in the wave. For you that has proved but the gateway of glory. The dawn of new life with the pure and the brave. They bid you farewell, those who mourn your wild daring. They shudder to think of your cold, lonely bed. Oh! Could we but tell them how well you are faring? They'd share in your joy now your body is dead. In depths of the sea that will soon melt and vanish. On heights of the astral your beauty revives. The grief that once marred it this glow will soon banish. With all that disfigured earth's lowlier lives. Nor shall you be saddened to think of their sadness. Who even may weep at your pitiful fate. Now weeping, the better they'll share in your gladness. When they too inherit the life they await. No graven stone tells where the form that once bound you restores to the earth, from the earth what it drew. How little you care, as the scenes now around you enchant your new senses with limitless view. But see! Who approaches? Reborn with new vigor. How needless 'twas even his fate to deplore. With rapture he sees you. No flames could disfigure that form. It is he. 'Tis your lover once more. There are many other well-known poems dealing with death that might be recast along similar lines, The Burial of Sir John Moore / for example, though those rather ponderous verses do right attract one to the task. Poetry, indeed, is dotted all over with blemishes due to ignorance of astral conditions, and perhaps it may be admitted that even theosophical literature, apart from poetry altogether, has sometimes tended to chill imagination by leaving too much out of account the gradual character of the transition from this life towards the illimitable future of human evolution. Natural law is very patient with the pardonable cravings of personality, and lofty teaching is sometimes made to seem repellent by neglecting this profound truth, as was illustrated by a remark I once heard of, made by a lady who said she was much attracted to theosophy but could not be a theosophist because she loved her husband and her children. One can easily understand the peculiar variety of foolishness on the part of some ill-qualified exponent of theosophy who gave her that impression. The charms of the higher astral life ought to find more frequent description in theosophical literature, as well as in the poetry of the future. Note: the substance of some of the various essays in this book has appeared in the 19th century, The Messenger, California, The Vahan, The Pioneer, Allahabad, Lucifer, and The Theosophist. Expanded Theosophical Knowledge was originally published as a pamphlet by the Theosophical Book Shop, 42, George Street, Edinburgh. Theosophical Teachings Liable to be Misunderstood, and The Pyramids and Stonehenge appear among the transactions of the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society. The substance of the superphysical laws of nature, and the higher occultism, was delivered in addresses to the Eleusinian Society, since merged in the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society.